13-year-old hired a hitman to kill her parents, acting untouchable. Then the judge made history. She walked into that courtroom like she owned it. 13 years old, still in braces, accused of hiring someone to end her parents' lives. And when the charges were read aloud, conspiracy, solicitation, double homicide, she didn't flinch. She smiled, like she knew something the entire room didn't. Like her age made her invisible to consequences. The judge asked if she understood the severity. She shrugged. What she didn't know was that every text, every payment, every arrogant word had been recovered, and the sentence about to come down would rewrite history. Her smirk was about to cost her everything. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. Willow Lane was the kind of street where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. Trimmed lawns, friendly waves, the sound of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. A working-class neighborhood where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other's kids. The family at number 42 seemed normal enough. Parents who worked hard, set boundaries, expected respect. Their daughter was polite when adults were watching, quiet, a little distant maybe, but what teenager isn't? But behind closed doors, something was shifting. Arguments were getting louder, rules were tightening, and one night, after being grounded for breaking curfew, she said 5 words that should have been a warning. "You're going to regret this." No one thought she meant it literally. The courtroom was silent except for the rustling of papers and the low hum of the air conditioning. She sat at the defense table, feet dangling above the floor, not quite tall enough for the chair built for adults. Her ponytail was neat. Her hoodie was clean. If you didn't know why she was there, you'd think she was waiting for her mother to pick her up from school. But the charges being read aloud told a different story. Conspiracy to commit murder. Solicitation of murder for hire. 2 counts. Her parents. The prosecutor's voice was steady, clinical, as if reading a grocery list. She didn't look down. She didn't cry. She examined her fingernails like the whole thing bored her. The courtroom gallery was packed. Journalists, family members, strangers who'd followed the story online. Everyone wanted to see the girl who'd allegedly done the unthinkable. The prosecutor stood and began outlining the case. After the incident, while investigators were still processing the scene, she'd gone to the mall, bought new clothes with money she wasn't supposed to have, posted photos online with captions about freedom, told a friend over text that she was finally living her life. No grief, no shock, just relief. The defense attorney objected twice in the first 10 minutes, but the facts were stubborn. They didn't care about objections. She thought the system would protect her. That's what everyone would say later. She believed that being 13 was a shield, that the law would see her age before it saw her actions. She'd researched it, apparently, looked up juvenile sentencing guidelines, told friends that kids don't go to real prison, that at worst she'd be out by 18. That confidence radiated off her even now, sitting in a room full of people who knew what she'd done. She thought she'd gamed the system. She thought she was untouchable. What she didn't know was that the judge looking down at her had already made a decision that would echo through courtrooms across the country. The prosecutor clicked a remote. A screen lit up behind him. Text messages. Recovered from a burner phone she'd thought was gone forever. Deleted. Wiped. Thrown into a dumpster 3 towns over. But digital forensics had pulled them back from the void like ghosts. The messages were cold. Transactional. How much? When can you do it? Make it look like a break-in. No emotion. No hesitation. Just logistics. The prosecution read them aloud, one by one, and with each message, the air in the room grew heavier. She shifted in her seat. The first crack in the armor, barely visible, but there. Then came the surveillance footage, a timestamp in the corner, 2 nights before the incident. A car that didn't belong on Willow Lane. Plates obscured with mud. It slowed in front of number 42, idled for 37 seconds, then drove off. The driver's face wasn't visible, but the passenger was, leaning forward, pointing. Investigators had matched the vehicle to a known associate, someone she'd been messaging on that same burner phone, someone with a record, someone who needed money. The pieces were lining up, and every single one pointed back to her. The defense attorney whispered something in her ear. She shook her head, still confident, still certain this would all blow over. But the judge hadn't spoken yet. He sat elevated, expressionless, watching everything unfold. His gavel rested beside a stack of legal briefs, thicker than a phone book. Precedents, case studies, arguments about age and accountability that had been debated for decades. He'd read them all. The defense would argue brain development, impulsivity, lack of foresight. The prosecution would argue premeditation, planning, motive. And somewhere in the middle, the judge would have to decide, was she a child who made a terrible mistake or someone who knew exactly what she was doing? The answer would change everything. The session ended with a scheduling of the next hearing. Evidence review, witness depositions, psychological evaluations, standard procedure. As the bailiff called for everyone to rise, she stood and turned toward the gallery. For just a moment, she locked eyes with a woman in the third row, her aunt, the only family member still willing to sit through this. The aunt's face was streaked with tears. The girl's face was blank. And then, just before turning back around, she smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a sad smile. A knowing smile, like she still believed she'd walk out of this untouched. That smile would be photographed, analyzed, replayed on every news channel. It would become the image people remembered, the moment that made the world ask, how could someone so young be so cold? The gavel hadn't fallen yet, but it was coming. Willow Lane looked like it had been designed by someone who believed in the American dream. The houses were modest but well kept. Small front yards with flower beds that bloomed every spring. Driveways where kids practiced basketball and neighbors chatted about weekend plans. It was the kind of place where people retired after decades, where they felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked during the day. No crime, no drama, just the steady rhythm of ordinary life. The kind of street where the worst thing that ever happened was a stolen package or a loud party. Until number 42 changed everything. The parents, Michael and Sarah, had lived there for nearly 15 years. They weren't wealthy. Michael worked construction, the kind of job that left his hands calloused and his back sore. Sarah managed the front desk at a dental office, always coming home with stories about difficult patients and insurance headaches. They clipped coupons. They drove cars with over 100,000 miles, but they were stable. They paid their mortgage on time. They showed up to parent-teacher conferences. They believed that structure and discipline would give their daughter the foundation they never had growing up. They didn't realize that same structure would become the thing she resented most. Their routines were predictable. Michael left for work at 6 in the morning, lunchbox packed the night before. Sarah dropped their daughter off at school on her way to the office. Dinner was at 6:30, always at the table, phones put away, homework before television, curfew at 9 on weekdays, 10:30 on weekends, chores on Saturday mornings, church on Sundays if they weren't too tired. It wasn't strict by most standards, but to a 13-year-old who watched her friends roam the mall unsupervised and post whatever they wanted online, it felt like prison. The rules weren't cruel, but they were consistent, and consistency in her mind was control. Neighbors remembered her as polite, the kind of kid who said, "Yes, ma'am," and "Thank you," without being prompted. She helped carry groceries for the elderly woman next door. She smiled when adults waved, but there was something distant about her, something the neighbors couldn't quite name. She didn't play outside much, didn't ride bikes with the other kids on the street, mostly stayed in her room with the door closed, music playing softly, curtains drawn even during the day. When asked how school was going, she'd give short answers. Fine, good, same as always. Never details, never stories, just enough to end the conversation. People chalked it up to teenage moodiness. No one thought to look deeper. But inside the house, things were starting to fracture. The arguments had been getting louder over the past 6 months. Slammed doors, raised voices that carried through the walls. Sarah confided in a coworker that their daughter had been caught lying about where she was after school, that she'd found a phone hidden in her backpack, not the one they'd given her, but a second one, cheap, prepaid. When confronted, their daughter said it was a friend's, that she was just holding it. The explanation didn't make sense, but what were they supposed to do? Ground her? Take away privileges? They tried, and every punishment made things worse. The mood swings became impossible to predict. One day she'd be chatty, almost affectionate, asking about their day and offering to help with dinner. The next, she'd be ice cold, answering in one-word responses, glaring like they'd done something unforgivable. Sarah started Googling phrases like teenage rebellion and adolescent anger. Michael suggested family counseling. Their daughter refused. Said therapists were for crazy people. That she was fine. That they were the problem, not her. They didn't push it. They thought she'd grow out of it. That this was just a phase every parent survived. They had no idea how deep the resentment ran, how every rule felt like a chain, how she'd started seeing them not as parents, but as obstacles. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in late September. She'd missed curfew by 2 hours, came home smelling like cigarette smoke with makeup smeared across her face. Michael was furious. Sarah was scared. They sat her down and laid out consequences. No phone for a month, no sleepovers, no mall trips. Straight home after school, and they'd be checking. She sat through the entire lecture in silence, arms crossed, jaw clenched. And when they finished, when Michael said, "Do you understand?" she stood up slowly and looked them both in the eye. Her voice was calm, too calm. "You're going to regret this." Then she walked upstairs and locked her bedroom door. They heard music turn on, loud enough to drown out anything else. Michael and Sarah exchanged a look. Concern maybe, but not fear. Not yet. They thought it was just words, just a teenager lashing out. They didn't know she'd already made a decision, that by morning a plan would be in motion. That night, the porch light stayed on until dawn, waiting for a daughter who'd already stopped seeing them as family. The timeline would later be reconstructed with the kind of precision that only comes after tragedy. Security cameras, phone records, witness statements pieced together like a puzzle no one wanted to solve. It started on a Thursday evening, unremarkable in every way except for what was about to happen. Michael came home at 5:40, same as always, parked in the driveway, grabbed his lunchbox from the passenger seat, waved to the neighbor trimming hedges 3 houses down. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, still in her work scrubs, carrying a bag of groceries. They had no idea they were being watched, no idea that everything they did that evening was being noted, timed, cataloged by someone who'd been paid to wait for the right moment. The car appeared on a neighbor's doorbell camera at 7:15, a dark sedan, windows tinted, plates covered with what looked like dried mud. It moved slowly down Willow Lane, out of place in a neighborhood where everyone recognized each other's vehicles. The car passed number 42 once, then circled back and parked 2 houses down, engine idling. The footage showed it sitting there for nearly 8 minutes. No one got out, no headlights turned off, just waiting. At 7:23, the car pulled forward, stopped directly in front of the house, and then the camera angle cut off. What happened in the next 17 minutes would only be known through forensic evidence and the cold confessions that would come later. Neighbors recalled sounds, not screams, nothing that dramatic, but small things they wouldn't think about until police asked. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street, remembered hearing a door close harder than usual, not a slam, but firm, deliberate. Mr. Patel, out walking his dog, saw headlights swing out from Willow Lane faster than normal, tires squealing slightly on the turn. He didn't think much of it. Teenagers joyriding maybe, someone late for something. He finished his walk and went inside. At 8:10, Sarah's sister called the house phone. It rang 12 times. No answer. She tried Sarah's cell. Straight to voicemail. Unusual, but not alarming. Not yet. People miss calls. People get busy. She left a message asking about weekend plans and hung up. By morning, the silence had turned into something heavier. Sarah's dental office called at 8:15, wondering where she was. She'd never missed a shift without calling. Michael's crew supervisor did the same at 8:30. Michael was the type who showed up early, not the type who no called, no showed. His co-workers joked that he'd probably show up to work on his deathbed. The sister called again, then drove over herself, a knot forming in her stomach that she couldn't explain. When she pulled onto Willow Lane, everything looked normal. The grass needed mowing. The garbage bins were still at the curb from collection day, but the front door was slightly open, just an inch, enough to know something was wrong. She didn't go inside. Later, she'd say it was instinct. A voice in her head that told her not to cross that threshold. She stood on the porch and called out. Sarah's name, Michael's name, nothing. Just the sound of the television still playing inside. Some morning show repeating the news on a loop. She called the police, told them she had a bad feeling, that her sister wasn't answering, and the door was open and something felt wrong. The dispatcher said an officer would be there in 10 minutes. She waited on the lawn, arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold. Neighbors started to notice, started coming outside, asking if everything was okay. She didn't know how to answer. When the police arrived, they approached carefully. One officer spoke to the sister while another examined the door. No signs of forced entry, no scratches around the lock, no broken windows. It had been opened with a key or from the inside. The officer knocked, announced himself, waited. Silence. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, hand near his radio. What he found would turn Willow Lane into a crime scene for the next 6 days. The house was neat, almost too neat. No signs of a struggle in the entryway, no overturned furniture, no robbery. The television was still on. Coffee mugs sat on the kitchen counter, one still half full. Everything looked like a normal Thursday evening, frozen in time, except for the two people who should have been there. The officer radioed for backup. Within 20 minutes, Willow Lane was swarmed. Patrol cars, detectives, a forensics van, yellow tape stretched across the lawn, cutting number 42 off from the rest of the street. Neighbors stood behind the line, whispering, speculating, filming on their phones. The sister sat in the back of a patrol car, shaking, answering questions she could barely process. And somewhere, investigators began asking the question that would crack the case wide open. Where was the daughter? She hadn't been found inside. Her room was empty. Her backpack was gone. At first, they thought maybe she'd been taken too. Maybe she was in danger. Maybe she was another victim. They were wrong. The first detective to check her room found something that shifted everything. Her bed was made, her clothes were organized, and on her desk, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a receipt, printed 2 days earlier, for a prepaid phone. The same brand found in the dumpster 3 towns over. She hadn't been taken. She'd left. And that changed everything. They found her at a friend's house 6 blocks away. She'd spent the night there, apparently. Told the friend's parents that her mom and dad had given permission for a last-minute sleepover. They hadn't thought to verify. Why would they? She was polite, well-mannered, the kind of kid who said, "Please and thank you." When the police knocked on the door at 9:30 that morning, she was eating cereal at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone like it was any other Friday. The officer who made contact later wrote in his report that her reaction was unnervingly calm. She looked up, saw the uniform, and asked if something was wrong. Not panicked, not afraid, just curious, like a neighbor asking about a noise complaint. They told her there'd been an incident at her house, that they needed her to come with them to answer some questions. She asked what kind of incident. The officer hesitated. Protocol said not to reveal too much at this stage, especially to a minor. He said it was serious, that her family had been trying to reach her. She set down her spoon, wiped her mouth with a napkin, and stood up. "Okay," she said. That was it. No follow-up questions, no tears, no visible worry. She grabbed her backpack, thanked her friend's mom for breakfast, and walked to the patrol car like she was getting a ride to school. The friend's parents stood in the doorway, confused, already pulling out their phones to call someone who might know what was happening. At the station, they brought her to a soft interview room, not the interrogation rooms with metal tables and cameras in the corners. This one had couches, warm lighting, a box of tissues on the side table that would go untouched. A victim advocate sat with her while detectives figured out how to proceed. She wasn't under arrest. She was a juvenile, and at this point, she was still considered a potential victim or witness. The advocate asked if she wanted water. She said no. Asked if she was okay. She shrugged. The silence stretched for nearly 10 minutes before a detective finally entered. He was gentle, trained for these situations. He sat across from her and explained, as carefully as possible, that her parents had been hurt, that they weren't okay, that she was safe now. He watched her face for the reaction. Nothing. No sharp intake of breath, no hand over her mouth. She blinked twice and asked, "How bad?" The detective wasn't expecting that question. Not phrased like that. Not in that tone. He exchanged a glance with the advocate. He told her it was very serious, that investigators were still working, that she didn't need to worry about details right now. She nodded slowly. Processing, maybe? Or performing processing. It was hard to tell. Then she asked the question that would haunt everyone in that room for years. "Can I still go to the mall this weekend?" The detective stared at her. The advocate's pen froze mid-note. She looked back at them, waiting for an answer, like it was a completely reasonable thing to ask. Like her parents' condition was a scheduling inconvenience. The detective cleared his throat, told her they'd talk about that later. First, he needed to ask her some questions. She said, "Okay," still no tears. He started with basics. When did she leave the house? Where was she going? Did she notice anything unusual? She answered in short, flat sentences. She'd left around 6:30. Told her parents she was going to study at her friend's house. They said fine. She walked over, spent the evening watching movies, fell asleep around 11, woke up this morning. That was it. The detective asked if her parents seemed upset or worried about anything. She said no, everything was normal. He asked if anyone had been bothering them. Strangers? Odd phone calls? She shook her head. Normal life. Normal night. He asked if she'd been in any trouble recently. A pause. Then, they grounded me, but that's not a big deal. The detective leaned forward slightly, asked what she'd been grounded for. She rolled her eyes like it was typical parent drama. Missing curfew, smoking with friends, normal teenager stuff. They overreacted, she said, made it into this huge thing. Took her phone. She paused, then corrected herself. They took my old phone. I had to borrow one from a friend. The detective's expression didn't change, but internally, alarms were going off. He asked if she still had that phone. She reached into her backpack without hesitation and handed it over. A cheap flip phone, the kind sold at gas stations. He asked whose it was. She said a girl from school let her borrow it. He asked for the girl's name. She gave it. He made a note. Then he asked if he could hold on to the phone for a bit. She said sure, didn't ask why, didn't seem concerned. After 30 more minutes of questions that went nowhere, they let her wait in another room while they regrouped. The friend's parents had agreed to keep her for now until family could be contacted. As she was leaving, the detective asked one more question, almost offhand. Is there anyone you can think of who might want to hurt your parents? She stopped in the doorway, thought about it, then shook her head. No, she said, everyone liked them. But her voice carried something the detective couldn't quite name. Not sadness, not fear, something closer to indifference. She left with the advocate, and the detective stood there holding the phone she'd handed over so willingly. Too willingly. His partner appeared beside him. That was... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They both felt it. The wrongness, the disconnect. It wasn't evidence, not yet, but instinct said this girl knew more than she was saying. Within 2 hours, the phone was logged into evidence and sent to the forensics lab with a priority request. The detective called the friend whose name she'd given. The friend had no idea what he was talking about, said she'd never lent anyone a phone, didn't even own a flip phone. The detective hung up and looked at his partner. The girl had just lied, calmly, easily, without blinking. And if she was lying about the phone, what else was she lying about? By late afternoon, the data recovery request was approved. Technicians began the painstaking work of pulling deleted files from a device that had been wiped multiple times. It would take days, maybe weeks, but they'd find it, whatever she thought she'd erased. The phone sat in a clear evidence bag under fluorescent lights, silent and waiting. It had already decided her future. She just didn't know it yet. The forensics lab worked in shifts, 24 hours a day. Technicians hunched over computers, running software that pulled fragments of data from devices people thought were clean. The phone she'd handed over so confidently sat connected to a machine that didn't care about factory resets or deleted apps. It saw everything, every text, every search, every conversation she thought had disappeared into the digital void. The lead technician had seen a lot in 15 years on the job. Cheating spouses, drug dealers, white-collar criminals. But when the first batch of recovered messages appeared on his screen, he stopped scrolling and called his supervisor. This wasn't standard evidence. This was a roadmap to something calculated and cold. The messages came back in fragments at first, incomplete sentences, timestamps out of order. But even partial, the picture was clear. She'd been talking to someone who didn't call her by name, someone she referred to only as Jay. The conversation spanned 3 weeks, starting the day after the argument with her parents, the very night she'd said they'd regret it. The first recovered message was simple. I need help with something, innocent enough on its own, but the response changed the context. What kind of help? And then her reply, the kind people don't talk about. The technician flagged it, kept pulling. The software worked like an archaeological dig, uncovering layers that had been buried deliberately. The language in the messages was disturbingly businesslike. No emotion, no hesitation, just logistics. How much would it cost, she'd asked. The response, depends on what you need done. She didn't dance around it, didn't use coded language or metaphors. She was direct, blunt. I need 2 people gone. Permanently. The technician read it 3 times to make sure he wasn't misinterpreting. He wasn't. The conversation continued. Negotiation. Terms. She asked if it could be done quickly. The other person said yes, but it would cost more. She asked how much more. He named a price. She didn't flinch, didn't argue, just asked how she was supposed to get that kind of money. That's when the payment discussion started. She couldn't access large amounts of cash without raising suspicion, but she had gift cards. Visa prepaid cards she'd been collecting from birthdays, holidays, holidays, odd jobs. She offered those. The person said it wasn't enough. She said she could get more, that her parents kept cash in the house, that after it was done, she'd have access to everything. The reply was skeptical. "How do I know you're serious?" She responded immediately, "Because I've been planning this for weeks, and I'm not changing my mind." The technician printed that message and walked it directly to the detective's desk. No email, no digital transfer. He wanted someone to see it in person, to understand the weight of what they were dealing with. The detectives read through the reconstructed thread in silence. There were dozens of messages, some deleted within seconds of being sent, others left up for hours before being wiped. She discussed timing, asked when her parents would both be home, mentioned their routines, suggested Thursday evenings because they were always tired, always distracted. And then, buried in a message sent at 2 a.m, the phrase that would become central to the prosecution's case, make it look random, like a break-in or something. "I can't be connected to this." It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. She wasn't asking someone to scare her parents or teach them a lesson. She was orchestrating their elimination with the precision of someone twice her age. The phone records gave them more. The number she'd been texting belonged to a burner, but investigators traced its activation to a convenience store in a rougher part of town. Surveillance footage showed a young man, early 20s, buying the phone with cash, tattoos on his forearms, backwards baseball cap. They ran his face through facial recognition and got a hit within an hour. His name was Jason Cruz, 22 years old. Priors for assault, theft, drug possession. He'd been arrested 4 times, but never served serious time. Exactly the kind of person who'd take a desperate job for fast money. Exactly the kind of person a 13-year-old girl could find if she knew where to look online. Detectives pulled every piece of surveillance footage from the area around Willow Lane for the week leading up to the incident. And there he was, Jason Cruz, driving the same dark sedan that had appeared on the neighbor's doorbell camera. He'd driven past the house 3 separate times in the days before, once in daylight, twice after dark, casing it, learning the patterns. The final piece of footage showed him parked 2 streets over on the night everything happened, sitting in his car, checking his phone. The timestamp matched perfectly with a message she'd sent him. "They're both home. Door is unlocked." She'd made it easy for him, removed every obstacle, and when it was done, when her parents were gone and investigators were searching for answers, she'd wiped the phone and handed it over like she had nothing to hide. But deletion isn't destruction. Every message she thought she'd erased was coming back, every instruction, every cold calculation. The detectives knew they had enough to bring her in for real questioning now, enough to shift her status from witness to suspect. But they wanted more. They wanted Jason Cruz. If they could get him to talk, to confirm that the messages were real and that she'd paid him, the case would be airtight. They put out a warrant for his arrest, found him 2 days later at a motel 30 miles outside the city. He didn't run, didn't resist, just put his hands up and asked if he could call his lawyer. In the interrogation room, he sat silent for nearly an hour. Then his attorney arrived. They talked, negotiated, and finally Jason Cruz made a decision that would seal her fate. He agreed to testify. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he'd tell them everything, and what he told them was worse than anyone imagined. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't a child lashing out in anger. This was orchestration, planning. A 13-year-old girl who decided her parents were obstacles and found someone willing to remove them. The phone had given them the proof. Now they had the confession. The case wasn't just strong anymore. It was undeniable. While investigators built their case, they started digging into who she really was. Not the polite girl neighbors saw, not the quiet student teachers barely noticed. The real person behind the performance. They interviewed school counselors, teachers, classmates. What emerged was a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for years. She was charming when she needed to be, could turn on warmth like a switch, smile at adults, offer to help, say exactly what people wanted to hear. But those who spent real time with her noticed something off, a disconnect between her words and her eyes, like she was always performing, always calculating. The guidance counselor described it as rehearsed empathy. She knew what emotions to display, but she didn't actually feel them. Her friends told investigators things they'd never told adults before. How she'd talk about manipulating teachers to get out of assignments. How she'd lie to her parents with such ease that even her friends believed her sometimes. One girl recalled a conversation conversation from months earlier, right after she'd gotten in trouble for stealing makeup from a drugstore. She'd laughed about it, said she'd cried in front of the manager, and he'd let her go with a warning. "People are so easy," she'd said. Another friend mentioned how obsessed she was with true crime, not the way most teenagers were interested in mysteries. She didn't care about solving them. She cared about the ones who almost got away with it. She'd watch interrogation footage and critique the suspects. "That's where they messed up," she'd say. "I'd never make that mistake." Teachers painted a similar picture. She was smart, not genius level, but above average. She understood consequences in theory, could explain cause and effect on tests, could write essays about moral responsibility and right versus wrong, but it was all academic. Performance without belief. Her English teacher remembered an assignment where students had to write about a difficult decision they'd made. Most kids wrote about choosing between friends or standing up to peer pressure. She wrote about deciding whether to tell her parents the truth about breaking a lamp. The entire essay framed her parents as unreasonable, as people who would punish her unfairly no matter what she did. She positioned herself as the victim of their expectations. The teacher had noted at the time that the essay lacked any sense of accountability. It was everyone else's fault, never hers. Investigators found her social media accounts. Most were public, carefully curated to show a normal teenager. Selfies, song lyrics, posts about homework and weekend plans. But there was a private account, one she thought no one knew about, shared only with a small group of online friends who lived in different states, people she'd never met in person. On that account, she was different, meaner, more honest. She complained constantly about her parents, called them controlling, said they didn't understand her, posted long rants about how unfair her life was because she had rules other kids didn't have. One post from 2 months before the incident read, "Nothing bad happens to kids. The system protects us no matter what. Adults just don't get that." She'd researched it, looked up juvenile sentencing laws, knew exactly how much protection her age gave her. The most chilling discovery came from her browser history. She'd searched for hitmen, literally typed "how to hire someone to hurt someone" into a search engine, clicked through dozens of articles, read forums, watched videos. She'd learned that most online offers were scams, that real connections happened through people you knew, people who knew people. She'd started asking questions at school, casual, offhand. "Do you know anyone who's tough? Like really tough?" One classmate thought she was looking for a boyfriend. Another thought she wanted protection from a bully. No one guessed the truth. She'd networked like she was looking for a job. And eventually, someone gave her a name. Someone who knew Jason Cruz, who said he'd do anything if the price was right. Even after her parents were gone, even as investigators closed in, she showed no remorse. Friends who texted her in those first days said she seemed relieved, lighter. She talked about finally being able to live her life, about not having anyone telling her what to do anymore. One friend asked if she was scared, if she was sad. She responded, "Why would I be sad? I'm finally free." That message was screenshotted and turned over to police. Every piece of evidence painted the same picture. A girl who saw her parents not as people who loved her, but as obstacles to the life she wanted, who believed her age made her untouchable, who planned their removal with the emotional distance of someone canceling a subscription. Psychologists would later use terms like narcissistic traits, lack of empathy, antisocial tendencies. But to the detectives reading through her messages and interviews, it was simpler than that. She thought she was smarter than everyone else, thought she'd found a loophole in the system, thought being 13 meant she could do anything and walk away. That confidence radiated from every text, every search, every conversation. She wasn't afraid of getting caught because she didn't believe there would be real consequences. She'd built her entire plan on the assumption that children were protected no matter what they did. And now, as investigators compiled everything they'd found, they prepared to test that assumption. The arrest warrant was signed on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, she'd be in custody, real custody. Not a soft interview room with a victim advocate, a cell. The handcuffs were already waiting. They came for her early, 6 in the morning, before the sun was fully up, before the friend's house where she'd been staying had stirred awake. 3 unmarked cars pulled up to the curb. Detectives in plain clothes. A female officer trained in juvenile apprehension. They knocked on the door quietly, not wanting to cause a scene. The friend's mother answered in her bathrobe, confused, still half asleep. They showed her the warrant. explained they needed to take the girl into custody. The mother's hand went to her mouth. She'd been watching the news. She knew what this meant. She led them upstairs to the guest room where the girl had been sleeping for the past week. The detectives knocked, waited. A voice from inside, groggy and annoyed. "What?" They opened the door. She was sitting up in bed, phone in hand, squinting at them in the dim light. The detective in front held up his badge and told her she was under arrest. Read her rights from a card he'd read 1,000 times before. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked if she could get dressed first. He nodded. She stood, grabbed clothes from a bag on the floor, and walked to the bathroom. They waited outside the door. She took her time, brushed her teeth, fixed her hair into a ponytail like she was getting ready for school. When she came out, she was calm, composed. She held out her wrists. The officer approached with handcuffs designed for juveniles, smaller, less intimidating. She rolled her eyes, actually rolled them. "Is this really necessary?" she asked. The detective didn't answer, just secured the cuffs and guided her downstairs. The friend's mother stood in the hallway, crying. She tried to say something, an apology maybe, or goodbye. The girl walked past her without a word. Outside, neighbors were starting to emerge, watching from windows, recording on phones. The detectives moved quickly, opening the back door of the sedan and guiding her inside. She settled into the seat like it was a ride to the mall, looked out the window at the growing crowd. One detective sat beside her, the other drove. Silence for the first few minutes. Then she spoke. "Am I going to miss cheer practice?" The detectives exchanged glances in the rearview mirror. The one beside her asked if she understood why she was being arrested. She shrugged. "You think I did something, but you don't actually know." Her voice was steady, no tremor, no fear, just mild irritation, like this was all a misunderstanding that would get cleared up soon enough. At the station, they processed her through the juvenile system, fingerprints, photographs. She stood against the height chart for her mugshot, and when the camera clicked, she wasn't crying. She wasn't stone-faced either. There was the faintest hint of a smile, not defiant, not sad, just there, like she was posing for a school photo. The booking officer told her to keep a neutral expression. She adjusted, barely. The photo would be released to the media within hours. It would become iconic. The image everyone associated with the case, a child in handcuffs with a half smile that seemed to prove she didn't understand the gravity of what she'd done. Or worse, that she understood perfectly and didn't care. The media eruption was instant. By noon, every major news outlet had the story. 13-year-old arrested in parent's murder. The headlines were careful, alleged, suspected. But the court of public opinion wasn't. Social media exploded. People demanded answers. How could a child do this? What kind of monster smiles in a mugshot? Advocacy groups argued she was still a juvenile, that her brain wasn't fully developed, that the system existed to rehabilitate, not punish. Others countered that some crimes transcended age, that premeditation this calculated couldn't be excused by a birth date. The debate raged online while she sat in a holding cell, flipping through a magazine someone had left behind, seemingly unaware or unconcerned that the world was watching. Her defense attorney arrived by early afternoon, a public defender named Marcus Hale who specialized in juvenile cases. He'd seen troubled kids before, ones who'd made mistakes, who'd acted impulsively, who'd been failed by systems and families. But when he sat across from her in the consultation room, he knew this was different. She wasn't scared, wasn't apologetic. She asked him how long this would take, if she'd be out in time for the holidays. He explained that she was being charged as a juvenile for now, but the prosecution was likely to push for adult certification. She asked what that meant. He told her it meant they'd try to move her case to adult court, that she could face adult consequences. She processed this for a moment, then asked, "But I'm 13. They can't actually do that, right?" Marcus had been doing this job for 20 years. He'd learned to keep his face neutral, to not react. But something about the way she said it, the absolute certainty in her voice, unsettled him. He explained that in cases involving serious charges, especially premeditated violent offenses, courts could certify juveniles as adults. It was rare. It required hearings and evaluations, but it was possible. She leaned back in her chair. "Okay," she said, "so we just argue I'm a kid, and they have to let me go eventually." He corrected her, told her that wasn't how it worked, that juvenile detention detention could still last years, that her record would follow her. She waved a hand dismissively. "I've seen the sentencing guidelines. Worst case, I'm out at 18. That's like 5 years. People do that for drug charges." Marcus realized then that she'd researched this, planned for this, built her entire strategy around being legally untouchable. The prosecution knew it too. That same afternoon, the district attorney held a press conference. She stood behind a podium and announced that her office would be seeking to certify the defendant as an adult. The evidence, she said, showed a level of planning and intent that went beyond youthful impulsivity. This was calculated, methodical, and the community deserved protection from individuals who posed this level of danger, regardless of age. The courtroom erupted in applause. Critics called it political, said they were sacrificing a child to appease public anger. But the DA didn't back down. She filed a motion for a certification hearing. A judge would review the evidence, hear expert testimony, and decide whether this case belonged in juvenile or adult court. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Until then, the girl would remain in juvenile detention. Marcus left the jail that evening knowing he was about to fight the hardest case of his career, and his client didn't even seem worried. As the courthouse doors closed behind him, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, questions shouted. Inside, she sat in her cell, already thinking about what she'd say at the hearing. Still convinced she'd win, still certain her age was armor. The system was about to test that theory, and the whole country would be watching. The certification hearing took place in a smaller courtroom than the one used for trials. Fewer seats, lower ceilings, but it was packed anyway. Journalists squeezed into the back rows. Family members sat stone-faced in the front. Court officers stood along the walls. Everyone wanted to see the girl who'd allegedly orchestrated her parents' elimination and then smiled for her mugshot. She entered in a juvenile detention uniform, pale blue scrubs that made her look even younger than 13. Her hair was pulled back. No makeup, no jewelry. Her attorney had likely coached her on appearance. Look young, look vulnerable. Remind the judge that she's still a child. She played the part well, walking with her head slightly down, hands clasped in front of her. But when she sat at the defense table and glanced at the gallery, there it was again, that faint, almost imperceptible smirk, like she was the only one who knew how this would end. Marcus Hale stood to present his case against adult certification. He was passionate, articulate. He talked about brain development, about how the adolescent prefrontal cortex isn't fully formed, how impulse control and long-term thinking don't fully mature until the mid-20s. He cited studies, referenced Supreme Court rulings that acknowledged juveniles were fundamentally different from adults. He argued that the entire purpose of the juvenile justice system was rehabilitation, not punishment. That children, even those who committed terrible acts, deserved a chance to grow and change. That sending a 13-year-old into the adult system was essentially giving up on her before she'd had the opportunity to become someone different. He spoke about her potential, about how keeping her in juvenile custody would allow for therapy, education, intervention. His voice carried genuine conviction. This was what he believed, what he'd built his career defending. The prosecutor stood next. Her name was Diana Reeves, and she'd been preparing for this moment since the arrest. She didn't dismiss the defense's points about brain development. She acknowledged them, agreed that most juveniles deserved the protections the law provided. But then she shifted, started walking the judge through a timeline, not of the crime itself, but of the planning. 3 weeks of deliberate, methodical preparation. She displayed the recovered text messages on a screen. Let the judge read them in silence. Messages that showed negotiation, problem-solving, risk assessment. She pointed out that the defendant hadn't acted in a moment of rage or fear. She'd planned across weeks, had researched methods, had found someone willing to help, had manipulated situations to create opportunity. This wasn't impulsivity. This was sustained, calculated intent. Diana pulled up browser history, showed the judge searches dating back 2 months, how to hire someone, juvenile sentencing laws, what happens to kids who commit crimes. The defendant had educated herself, had understood the consequences, and decided they were worth the risk. Diana asked the judge to consider not just the crime, but the mindset behind it. A child who acted on impulse could be rehabilitated, but someone who planned this carefully, who showed this level of manipulation and forethought, posed a different kind of danger. She wasn't asking the court to punish a child for being a child. She was asking them to acknowledge that some actions transcended age, that the community needed protection, that justice required accountability. Throughout both presentations, the girl sat perfectly still. She didn't fidget, didn't whisper to her attorney. She watched the proceedings like someone watching a movie about someone else's life. When Marcus spoke about her potential for rehabilitation, she nodded slightly, performing agreement. When Diana displayed the text messages, she looked at them without visible emotion, just reading, observing. At one point, she even stifled a yawn. The judge noticed. He'd been watching her the entire time, taking notes not just on what the attorney said, but on how she reacted, or didn't react. His pen moved across the page steadily, recording behavior, demeanor, the disconnect between the gravity of the situation and her apparent indifference. Then Diana did something that shifted the energy in the room. She asked permission to display photographs. The judge granted it. The screen changed, and suddenly, there they were. Michael and Sarah. Not crime scene photos, family photos. Michael in his work boots, arm around his daughter at a school event. Sarah laughing in the kitchen, flower on her apron. Both of them together on a vacation, smiling at the camera with their daughter between them. A family that looked happy, normal, intact. The gallery went silent. Someone in the back row sobbed quietly, and for the first time since the hearing began, the girl's expression changed. It was subtle, a tightening around her eyes, a shift in her jaw. Not grief, not guilt, but something closer to discomfort, like seeing them reminded her of something she'd been trying to forget. Or maybe she just didn't like that everyone was looking at them, at proof that they'd been real people who'd loved her. The judge let the photos stay on the screen, didn't rush past them, let the weight of who they were, who they'd been, settle over the courtroom. Marcus tried to redirect, objected that the photos were prejudicial. The judge overruled, said understanding the victims was as important as understanding the defendant. The photos stayed up for another full minute. The girl looked away, stared at the table. Her hands, which had been relaxed, were now clenched, small cracks forming in the armor she'd worn so confidently. When Diana finally moved on, when the screen went dark, the girl exhaled slowly, composed herself, but the judge had seen it, noted it. Whatever she'd felt in that moment, it wasn't remorse. It was annoyance that her control had slipped. When both sides finished, the judge announced he would take the matter under advisement. But before making a certification ruling, he wanted more information. He ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation, not just one expert, but a panel. He wanted to understand her cognitive development, her emotional capacity, her potential for rehabilitation. The evaluation would take weeks, involve interviews, tests, observations. Until then, she'd remain in juvenile detention. Court was adjourned. As the bailiff called for everyone to rise, the judge did something unusual. He looked directly at her, held her gaze, and in that moment, she seemed to realize this wasn't going the way she'd planned, that her age might not be the shield she thought it was. The judge's pen tapped once against his notepad, a small sound, but in the silence of the courtroom, it echoed like a gavel, a reminder that someone was finally paying attention, not to her age, but to her choices, and the difference between the two. The psychological evaluations took 3 weeks. She was interviewed by 4 separate experts, a forensic psychologist, a child development specialist, a psychiatrist who'd evaluated hundreds of juveniles, and a neuropsychologist who ran cognitive tests designed to measure planning ability, impulse control, and moral reasoning. They each spent hours with her. Some sessions lasted entire afternoons. She answered their questions, completed their tasks, drew pictures when asked, told stories about ink blots, responded to hypothetical scenarios, and through it all, she performed exactly as someone her age should, until she didn't. Until small cracks revealed what was underneath. The experts compiled their findings independently. When they compared notes before submitting reports to the court, they found something disturbing. They'd all reached the same conclusion. The forensic psychologist went first in her testimony. She explained that she'd administered standard assessments used to evaluate juvenile offenders, tests measuring cognitive development, emotional regulation, capacity for empathy. The results showed someone operating at or above age level in almost almost every category. Her IQ tested in the above-average range. Her verbal reasoning was exceptional. She could articulate complex thoughts, understand abstract concepts, predict outcomes. There was no developmental delay, no cognitive impairment, no learning disability that might explain impaired judgment. In fact, her planning and organizational skills tested higher than most adults. She could think sequentially, anticipate problems, devise solutions. The psychologist stated plainly, this was not a child who acted without understanding consequences. This was someone who understood them perfectly and chose her actions anyway. The child development specialist offered a similar assessment, but focused on emotional capacity. She'd spent sessions asking the girl about her feelings, about how she thought her parents had felt, about whether she understood that death was permanent. The girl answered everything correctly, could define emotions accurately, could explain that death meant someone was gone forever, could articulate that families grieved when they lost someone, but there was a disconnect between knowledge and feeling. She knew the right answers, the way someone knows facts for a test. When asked how she felt about what happened, she described feeling relieved and free. When pressed about whether she missed her parents, she paused, thought about it like it was a trick question, then said, "Sometimes I miss having someone cook dinner, not the people, the function they served." The psychiatrist's evaluation revealed the most concerning pattern. He'd assessed for what clinicians called callous, unemotional traits, lack of guilt, shallow emotions, indifference to others' feelings, manipulative behavior, lack of empathy. The criteria read like a checklist, and she met nearly every marker. He'd shown her photos of people in distress and asked what she thought they were feeling. She could label the emotions correctly: sad, scared, angry. But when asked if seeing someone in pain bothered her, she shrugged, said it depended on whether she knew them. And even then, she admitted, she mostly just felt annoyed when people cried around her. It made situations dramatic, she said. The psychiatrist explained to the court that these traits in adolescence were rare but significant. They indicated someone who understood social rules intellectually but didn't internalize them emotionally. The neuropsychologist presented brain scans and cognitive test results. He'd been looking for evidence of impulsivity, of poor executive function, of the kind of immature decision-making typical in teenagers. What he found instead was someone whose planning and problem-solving abilities were remarkably developed. She'd scored in the 95th percentile on tasks requiring sequential thinking and delayed gratification. She could plan multiple steps ahead, could resist immediate rewards for larger future gains, could understand risk versus reward. He showed the court a comparison. Her scores placed her cognitively closer to a 20-year-old than a 13-year-old in terms of planning capacity. The defense had argued her brain wasn't developed enough to understand her actions. The evidence suggested otherwise. Her brain understood perfectly. It just didn't care about the moral weight. Each expert was asked the critical question: did she understand the permanence of what she'd planned? Did she comprehend that her parents would be gone forever? That there was no undoing it? All four answered the same way. Yes, unequivocally, yes. She understood death wasn't temporary, understood her parents wouldn't come back, understood the finality, and she'd proceeded anyway. One expert noted something chilling from their interviews. When asked if she'd thought about what life would be like after her parents were gone, she described it in detail: where she'd live, who she'd stay with, how much freedom she'd have. She'd fantasized about the aftermath with the excitement of someone planning a vacation. There was no horror at the thought, no moment where the reality made her reconsider, just anticipation. The defense tried to recover. Marcus questioned the experts about the reliability of diagnosing personality disorders in minors, about how labels like antisocial or narcissistic shouldn't be applied to developing brains. The experts agreed that formal diagnoses were premature, but they stood by their assessments. Whether you called it a disorder or a trait pattern, the evidence was clear. She'd planned deliberately, understood consequences, felt no remorse. The defense's credibility was crumbling with each testimony. The argument that she was just an impulsive child caught up in emotions no longer held weight. The science said otherwise. And during the entire proceedings, she sat at the defense table, doodling in the margins of a legal pad, drawing flowers, geometric patterns, patterns, not taking notes, not listening with concern, just passing time. The jury wasn't seated yet. This was still the certification hearing. But the courtroom sketch artist captured her perfectly. Head tilted, pen moving across paper, expression blank. The sketch would run in newspapers the next day with a caption that asked what most people were thinking. What kind of child shows no emotion during testimony about her own capacity for violence? When the last expert finished, the judge took a 15-minute recess. When he returned, he made his ruling. Based on the evidence presented, the psychological evaluations, and the nature of the alleged offenses, he was granting the prosecution's motion. The case would be certified to adult court. She would be tried as an adult. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs. Marcus immediately stated his intent to appeal. But the judge was firm. The decision stood. And for the first time since her arrest, the girl's face showed something other than confidence. Her eyes widened slightly. Her hand stopped mid-doodle. She looked at Marcus. He leaned over and whispered something. Probably reassurance, probably strategy. But her expression didn't change. The armor had cracked. The trial date was set for 8 weeks out. She was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, no longer headed to juvenile detention, but to county jail, where she'd be held in a segregated unit for her age. As she passed the gallery, someone shouted. The bailiff intervened, but the words hung in the air. "You're not special anymore." She didn't look back, just kept walking, but her shoulders were tense, her confidence finally starting to fracture. The sketch artist's drawing froze that moment, the smirk replaced with something closer to fear. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in November. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, cameras, protesters holding signs on both sides of the debate. Some demanded justice for the victims. Others argued that trying a child as an adult was cruel and unusual. The media had turned this into a national conversation about youth, crime, and accountability. Inside, the courtroom was silent, every seat filled. The jury had been selected after days of questioning. 12 people who'd promised they could be impartial despite everything they'd heard. They filed in and took their seats, eyes immediately going to the defendant. She sat between her attorneys, dressed in clothes that made her look younger. A cardigan, simple pants, hair down around her shoulders. The prosecution had objected to the styling, calling it manipulative. The judge allowed it, but warned the defense that juries weren't easily fooled. Diana Reeves stood for her opening statement. She didn't waste time with preamble. She walked the jury through the timeline, showed them the argument that started it all, the grounding, the threat. Then she showed them what came next. Not a cooling-off period, not regret, but planning. She displayed the text messages on screens throughout the courtroom. Let the jury read them in silence. Watch the dates. See how the conversations evolved from vague inquiries to specific instructions. She synced the messages with surveillance footage. Text sent at 7:15. They're both home. Camera footage at 7:16. Dark sedan pulling onto Willow Lane. Text at 7:20. Door is unlocked. Footage at 7:21. Figure approaching the house. The synchronization was devastating. It removed any doubt about whether the messages were real or whether she'd been involved. The timeline proved coordination, proved she was directing everything in real time. Then came the financial trail. Bank records showed her parents had withdrawn $400 in cash 2 weeks before the incident. Emergency fund money they kept in a safe in their bedroom, that money disappeared. Investigators found evidence she'd accessed the safe, her fingerprints on the dial, scratches around the lock from inexperienced handling. She'd taken the cash and converted it to prepaid gift cards. The receipts were recovered from her room. Those same gift card numbers appeared in transaction records tied to Jason Cruz. She'd paid him $300 up front. The remaining $100 promised after. Diana showed the jury each receipt, each transaction, each piece of evidence that this wasn't theoretical. She'd funded her parents' elimination with money they'd saved for emergencies. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jason Cruz was called to the stand on day 3. He walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, escorted by 2 deputies. He'd already pleaded guilty to his role in exchange for testimony and a reduced sentence. 20 years instead of life. He sat in the witness box and refused to look at the defendant. Diana asked him to describe how he'd been contacted. He said a mutual acquaintance had told him about a job. Easy money. He hadn't known the details at first. When he found out it involved harming someone, he'd hesitated. Then she doubled the offer, promised more money after, said it needed to look random. He'd met her once in person, at a park. She'd been calm, professional, told him the address, the schedule, the best time, handed him half the money in an envelope. He said he'd almost backed out, but he needed the cash, had debts, had people looking for him, so he'd agreed. Diana asked him to describe what she'd said during that meeting. He paused, swallowed, then repeated her words. Make sure they don't suffer. I don't want them to know it was me. Not remorse, just logistics. She didn't want them dying with knowledge of her involvement. Not because it would hurt them more, but because it made her look worse. He said she'd asked if he'd done this before. He'd lied and said yes. She'd nodded, seemed relieved, like hiring someone with experience. She'd asked how long it would take. He'd said quick. She'd said good. Then she'd stood up, told him to delete her number after, and walked away. No second thoughts, no hesitation, just a transaction. He described following through with the plan, going to the house, finding the door unlocked like she'd promised, everything happening exactly as she'd arranged. When Diana asked if he'd had any doubt about whether she understood what she was asking for, he shook his head. She knew exactly what she wanted. During his testimony, the defendant stared at the table, wouldn't look at him, wouldn't meet his eyes. Marcus had likely told her not to react, not to give the jury anything to read into, but the avoidance was obvious. When Jason described their meeting in the park, her hand went to her hair, twisted a strand around her finger, a nervous habit, breaking through the composure. When he repeated her words about making sure her parents didn't suffer, her jaw clenched, subtle but visible. The jury watched her, watched how she wouldn't look at the man she'd paid, wouldn't face the reality of what his testimony meant. One juror in the back row wiped her eyes. Another shook his head slowly. You could see it happening, the pieces connecting in their minds. This wasn't a troubled child who'd acted impulsively. This was coordination, manipulation, cold calculation. The defense cross-examined Jason aggressively, tried to poke holes in his story, asked if he'd been offered a deal in exchange for testimony. He admitted he had. They asked if he'd say anything to reduce his sentence. He said no, just the truth. They asked if a grown man taking orders from a 13-year-old made sense. He said it didn't matter what made sense. It was what happened. Marcus tried to paint him as the real villain, the adult who should have known better, who should have refused, who bore the actual responsibility. But the damage was done. The jury had heard her words from his mouth, had seen the evidence of planning, had watched her refuse to even acknowledge him. When Jason was escorted out, the courtroom sat in heavy silence, the kind that follows something undeniable. Diana rested her case that afternoon, told the jury she'd proven beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant had planned, funded, and directed the actions that led to her parents' deaths, that her age didn't erase intent, that understanding consequences meant bearing them. The defense would present their case next, would bring experts to talk about her youth, her capacity for change, the possibility of rehabilitation. But as the judge dismissed everyone for the day, you could feel it, the shift in the room. The jury had made up their minds, or at least started to. The verdict wasn't official yet, but it was coming. And when the courtroom cleared, one juror stayed seated longer than the others, staring at the empty witness stand where Jason had sat, where the truth had finally been spoken aloud. She wiped her eyes one more time before standing. The sketch artist captured that moment. A single juror, hand to face, the weight of what they'd heard settling like stones. The jury deliberated for 2 days, 48 hours of waiting while the entire courtroom held its breath. The defendant was kept in a holding cell adjacent to the courthouse. Her attorneys visited twice, brought her updates that meant nothing because no one knew what was happening behind the closed doors of the deliberation room. She asked Marcus how long juries usually took. He said it varied. She asked if a long deliberation meant they were undecided. He said sometimes. She leaned back against the concrete wall and said she thought they'd see it her way, that once they really thought about her age, they'd realize this whole thing was overblown. Marcus didn't respond, just gathered his papers and left. By the second day, news vans had set up permanent stations outside the courthouse. Reporters did live updates every hour, even though there was nothing new to report. The world was waiting. The call came at 3 p.m. on the second day. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled within 30 minutes. Same seats, same faces, but the energy was different now. Tighter, more tense. People whispered theories to each other, predicted outcomes, argued about what justice looked like in a case like this. The defendant was brought in wearing the same clothes she'd worn throughout the trial, the cardigan that made her look younger. But something had changed in her face. The confidence from the first day was gone, replaced by something harder to read. Not quite fear, not quite resignation. Maybe the beginning of understanding that this wasn't going to end the way she'd planned. She sat at the defense table and her leg bounced beneath it. A small, involuntary movement. the first real sign of nervousness anyone had seen. The jury filed in, 12 faces, carefully neutral, trained not to look at the defendant because looking could signal the verdict before it was read. They took their seats. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s, who worked as a librarian, held a folded piece of paper. The judge asked if they'd reached a unanimous verdict. She stood and said yes. The bailiff took the paper from her hand and carried it to the judge. He unfolded it, read it silently. His expression gave nothing away. Then he handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the foreperson. The judge asked the defendant to stand. She did, slowly. Marcus stood beside her, placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. Whether for support or to keep her steady, it was hard to say. The courtroom went absolutely silent. No coughs, no shifting, just the sound of breathing and the air conditioning humming overhead. The judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict. She looked down at the paper. Her voice was clear, steady. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The word landed like a physical blow. The defendant's knees buckled slightly. Marcus's hand on her shoulder tightened. The gallery erupted, gasps, crying. Someone shouted, "Yes," before the judge's gavel came down hard. Order. He demanded order. The room quieted, but the energy didn't dissipate. It hung there, electric and heavy. The foreperson continued. On the charge of solicitation of murder for hire, we find the defendant guilty. 2 counts. Guilty on both. The defendant stood frozen, staring straight ahead, her mouth slightly open like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. For the first time since her arrest, she looked like what she was, a child, scared, confused, realizing too late that the armor she'd built around her age had shattered completely. The judge thanked the jury for their service, told them they were dismissed. They filed out, some of them visibly shaken. The librarian who'd read the verdict had tears in her eyes. This wasn't easy for anyone, not even the people who'd voted to convict. The judge turned his attention to the attorneys, asked if there were any immediate motions. Marcus stood, requested that his client remain free on bond pending sentencing. Diana objected immediately, stood and argued that the defendant had been convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder conspiracy, that she posed a danger to the community, that there was flight risk given the severity of the potential sentence. The judge didn't even hesitate, denied the motion. The defendant would remain in custody. Her head dropped, the reality sinking in. She wasn't going home, wasn't going back to anything resembling normal life. Not now, maybe not ever. Then the real battle began, the one that would determine whether she spent decades in prison or had a chance at something resembling a future. Marcus stood and addressed the judge directly. He acknowledged the verdict, said they would respect the jury's decision, but he urged the court to remember during sentencing that his client was still a child, that the entire juvenile justice system was built on the principle that young people could change, that brain science showed adolescents were fundamentally different from adults in their capacity for rehabilitation. He cited cases where juveniles convicted of serious crimes had gone on to lead productive lives after intervention and therapy. He argued that a life sentence or anything close to it for a 13-year-old was essentially giving up on the possibility of redemption, that the court had an opportunity to balance accountability with mercy, to recognize that she'd made a terrible choice, but that choice didn't have to define the rest of her existence. Diana stood next. Her approach was different. She didn't argue against the possibility of change, didn't claim that rehabilitation was impossible. Instead, she focused on protection, on the community's right to safety. She reminded the judge of the evidence, the planning, the research, the manipulation, the complete lack of remorse even after conviction. She argued that this wasn't a single bad decision made in a moment of weakness. This was sustained, calculated action taken over weeks with full knowledge of the consequences. She pointed out that the defendant had shown no empathy for her victims, no grief for her parents, no acknowledgement of the harm she'd caused. Every psychological evaluation had noted the same concerning traits: callousness, manipulation, shallow emotions. She asked the judge to consider what kind of danger someone with those traits posed if released back into society without adequate consequences. Diana walked to the prosecution table and picked up a folder, opened it, and pulled out photographs photographs, the same family photos that had been shown during the certification hearing. Michael and Sarah smiling, living, loving their daughter. She held them up for the judge to see, reminded him that two people who'd done nothing except try to parent their child were gone, that they'd never see another birthday, another holiday, would never know grandchildren or retirement or any of the thousand small joys that make up a life. She said that justice wasn't just about the person who committed the crime. It was about the people who suffered from it, the family left behind, the community that needed to feel safe. She asked for a sentence that reflected the severity of the harm, that protected future potential victims, that sent a message that some actions carried consequences no matter how old you were when you made them. The judge listened to both sides without interrupting. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, looked at the defendant who was still standing, pale and shaking slightly. He told her she could sit. She did, almost collapsed into the chair. He said he needed time to consider the appropriate sentence, that this was not a decision to be made lightly or quickly. He wanted to review all the evidence again, read the psychological reports thoroughly, consider the arguments from both sides. He scheduled sentencing for 4 weeks out. In the meantime, he said he would accept victim impact statements from family members, from anyone whose life had been affected by this crime. He wanted to hear from them before making his final decision. The courtroom understood what that meant. The family would have their say, would have a chance to speak directly about their loss, to put faces and voices to the grief that had been abstract until now. As the judge prepared to adjourn, he did something unexpected. He looked directly at the defendant and spoke to her, not through her attorneys, not about her, to her. He said that she'd been found guilty by a jury of her peers, that she would face consequences for her actions, but that before he decided what those consequences would be, he wanted her to hear from the people her choices had affected. He wanted her to sit in that courtroom and listen to what she'd taken from them, what she'd destroyed. He said he hoped she would really listen, really hear them, because their pain was real even if she hadn't yet learned how to feel it. The defendant looked up at him. For just a moment, their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not understanding, but maybe the first crack in the wall she'd built around herself, the first hint that the armor wasn't just broken, it was gone. Court was adjourned. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The bailiff approached to escort the defendant back to custody. She stood on unsteady legs. Marcus whispered something to her. She nodded, but didn't seem to process it. As she was led toward the side door, she glanced back at the gallery one last time. Her aunt was there, the only family member who still came, still tried. The aunt's face was wet with tears, not tears of relief or satisfaction, just sadness, deep, endless sadness for everyone involved. The defendant looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked through the door. The handcuffs clicked as they secured her wrists, the sound of metal against metal, final, unforgiving. The courtroom emptied slowly, people talking in hushed voices, journalists rushing to file stories. The jury's decision would be headline news within minutes. But inside that courtroom, in the silence after everyone left, something heavier remained. The weight of a child convicted as an adult, of a family destroyed by one of its own, of a justice system trying to balance punishment and hope. The sketch artist stayed behind, drawing one final image: the empty defense table, the chair where she'd sat, the space where a 13-year-old girl had heard the word guilty and finally understood that her age couldn't save her. That understanding had come too late to change anything, but it had come. And in 4 weeks, when the family stood before the judge and spoke about who they'd lost, she'd have to sit there and listen, have to face what she'd done without the shield of denial or arrogance. The victim impact hearing was coming, and unlike the trial where she could stay detached and distant, this would be personal, raw, unavoidable. The photo her aunt had left on the bench sat there still, Michael and Sarah, smiling, unaware their daughter would one day sit in a courtroom and hear people describe the hole their absence left. That photo would remain there overnight, a reminder that some losses could never be calculated by a jury or quantified in a sentence. Some things, once broken, stayed broken forever. The victim impact hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. The courtroom filled early. Extended family members arrived in groups, holding hands, supporting each other through the doors. Sarah's sister, who'd been the one to find the house that morning, came with her husband and 2 teenage children. Michael's brother drove in from 3 states away, eyes already red before he even sat down. down. Cousins, childhood friends, co-workers who'd known them for years, neighbors from Willow Lane who'd watched Michael mow his lawn every Saturday, and Sarah wave from her car each morning. They filled the gallery, a silent testimony to two lives that had mattered, that had touched people, that had left holes that would never be filled. The defendant was brought in last. She wore the same cardigan, but it looked different now, less like an innocent child and more like a costume that no longer fit. She sat at the defense table and stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the gathering behind her. The judge entered, and the room rose. He took his seat and addressed the court, explained that today was not about legal arguments or evidence. Today was about the people left behind, about giving voice to grief that couldn't be measured in years or sentences. He said he would listen to anyone who wished to speak, that there was no time limit, no restriction on emotion. This was their day, their moment to say what needed to be said. He looked at the first row where Sarah's sister sat, asked if she was ready. She nodded, stood slowly, walked to the podium set up in the center of the courtroom. Her hands shook as she gripped the edges. She'd prepared a statement, brought notes, but when she opened her mouth, the words came from somewhere deeper than the paper in front of her. She talked about Sarah, not as a victim, as a person, a sister who'd shared a bedroom with her growing up, who'd braided her hair before school, who'd called her every Sunday morning without fail for 15 years. She described Sarah's laugh, how it was too loud and embarrassing sometimes, but infectious, how she'd snort when something was really funny and then laugh even harder at herself for snorting. She talked about how Sarah had been terrified during her pregnancy, how she'd called at 2 a.m, convinced something was wrong, how she'd held her niece for the first time and cried because she was so grateful everything had turned out okay. She described the kind of mother Sarah had been, patient, loving, firm when she needed to be, but never cruel. She talked about the last conversation they'd had, a week before. Sarah complaining about teenager drama, saying her daughter was going through a phase, that it would pass, that they just needed to stay consistent. Her voice broke. She gripped the podium harder. She thought they had time, she said. She thought they'd get through this and laugh about it someday. She thought her daughter would grow up and understand why they set boundaries, why they cared enough to say no. She looked up from her notes, directly at the defendant. She loved you. She loved you more than anything in this world. And you took her away before she could see who you'd become, before she could know if all the worry and the rules and the late nights wondering if she was doing it right would pay off. You took that from her. You took everything. The defendant's expression didn't change. She stared at a spot on the wall behind the judge, unmoved, unreachable. The sister's husband had to come help her back to her seat. She was shaking too hard to walk alone. Michael's brother spoke next. He was a veteran, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who didn't cry easily, but his voice was thick with emotion from the first word. He talked about growing up with Michael, how they'd been inseparable as kids, built forts in the woods behind their house, got in trouble for tracking mud inside, how Michael had been the responsible one even then, always looking out for his younger brother, always making sure everyone was okay. He described how proud Michael had been when his daughter was born, how he'd called from the hospital at 5 a.m, barely coherent with joy, how he'd shown pictures to everyone he met, strangers in grocery stores, people at the gas station, anyone who'd look, how he'd worked overtime for months to afford a bigger place when she started school, how he'd coached her soccer team even though he didn't know the first thing about soccer, just wanted to be involved, wanted to be there. He talked about the last time they'd spoken. Michael had mentioned things were tough at home, that his daughter was pulling away, that he didn't know how to reach her anymore. I told him it was normal, Michael's brother said, his voice cracking. I told him all teenagers go through rebellion, that she'd come around, that he just needed to be patient and keep showing up. He paused, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He died thinking he'd failed her somehow, died thinking he wasn't enough, that if he'd just done something different, been someone different, maybe she wouldn't be so angry. He never got to know that it wasn't his fault, that he was a good father, the best father, and that some people just... He couldn't finish, shook his head, walked back to his seat with his shoulders hunched, defeated by a grief that had no outlet. A coworker of Sarah's spoke about how she'd always talked about her daughter, brought in school projects to show everyone, bragged about good grades, worried out loud about social pressures and mean girls and all the things mothers worry about. She said Sarah had been planning a mother-daughter trip, wanted to take her somewhere special when she turned 14, had been saving money quietly, looking at destinations. She wanted to reconnect, the co-workers said, wanted to remind her daughter that they were a team, that even through the hard years, they'd always have each other. The trip would never happen. The money sat in an account no one knew what to do with. Another neighbor spoke, then another, each one adding layers to the portrait of two people who'd been ordinary in the best way, who'd worked hard, loved deeply, made mistakes like everyone does, but tried their best, who'd deserved to grow old, to see their daughter graduate, get married, have children of her own, all the milestones they'd never witness. Then came the photographs. The prosecution had compiled them into a presentation, not crime scene photos, not evidence, just life. Sarah and Michael on their wedding day, young and smiling and full of hope. Michael holding his newborn daughter in the hospital, tears on his face. Sarah helping her daughter blow out candles on a birthday cake, both of them laughing. Family vacations, school plays, Christmas mornings, the mundane and the meaningful all mixed together. The photos played on a screen at the front of the courtroom, set to silence. No music, no narration, just images of a family that had been whole. The gallery watched. Many people cried openly. The defendant's aunt covered her mouth with both hands, but the defendant herself barely glanced at the screen when a photo appeared of her sitting between her parents at a restaurant. All three of them smiling at the camera, she looked away entirely, studied her hands, picked at her cuticles, anything to avoid seeing what she'd destroyed. The judge watched her, noted every averted glance, every moment of disconnection. When the photos ended, he asked if anyone else wished to speak. Sarah's mother stood. She was in her 70s, frail. She walked to the podium with a cane, took a long time to settle herself. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. She said she'd already lost her husband 5 years ago, that Sarah had been her anchor through that grief, had called every day, visited every week, made sure she wasn't alone. Now I've lost her too, she said. I've lost my child. And that's not the order things are supposed to happen. Parents aren't supposed to bury their children. We're supposed to go first, supposed to leave them behind to live full lives. She looked at the defendant, her great-granddaughter. I don't understand, she said simply. I've tried. I've prayed. I've asked God to help me understand how a child could do this to people who loved her, and I can't. I just can't. She didn't ask for a harsh sentence, didn't demand vengeance, just said she hoped someday the girl sitting at that table would understand what she'd taken, would feel the weight of it, would carry it the way the rest of them would carry it for the rest of their lives. That's my prayer, she said. Not that you suffer, but that you understand. That you wake up one day and it finally hits you what you've done, and that when it does, you have to live with it. She walked back to her seat slowly. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying, trying to be quiet about it, failing. The defendant sat motionless. If the words affected her, if any of it penetrated the wall she'd built, she gave no sign. Her face remained blank, her eyes dry. The only movement was her hand, still picking at her cuticles until one started to bleed. She noticed, stopped, put her hands in her lap, the small spot of blood on her finger, the only color in an otherwise pale, frozen expression. The judge let the silence sit. Didn't rush to fill it, let the weight of everything that had been said settle over the courtroom like snow. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. He thanked everyone who'd shared, said their words mattered, that he'd heard them, that he would carry them into his deliberations about sentencing. He looked at the defendant, asked if she had anything she wanted to say. Marcus stood quickly, said his client would respectfully decline to make a statement at this time. The judge nodded, said he understood, but the opportunity had been offered. Noted. He announced that he would deliver his sentencing decision the following morning at 9. Said he'd spent weeks considering the evidence, the evaluations, the arguments from both sides, and after hearing from the family today, he knew what needed to be done. Court was adjourned. As people stood to leave, Sarah's mother approached the defense table. The bailiff moved to intercept, but the judge allowed it. She stood there, looking at her great-granddaughter. The girl finally looked up, met her eyes. The grandmother didn't say anything, just placed a photo on the table. It was one from the presentation, Sarah and her daughter at the beach, both in swimsuits, both sunburned and happy, arms around each other. The grandmother's hand shook as she set it down. Then she walked away, left it there. The defendant stared at it. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Not quite grief, not quite regret. but recognition maybe of what had been, of what would never be again. Then the bailiff said it was time to go. She stood, left the photo on the table, walked toward the holding cell. But before the door closed, she glanced back. One last look at the photograph she'd left behind, at the evidence of love she'd never valued until it was gone. The door closed, the lock clicked, and the courtroom emptied slowly, leaving only that single photograph on an empty table, a ghost of a family that would never smile together again. The courthouse opened early that Friday morning. By 7, a line had already formed outside. News crews set up their equipment on the lawn. Protesters gathered on opposite sides of the walkway. One group held signs reading, "Justice for Sarah and Michael." The other held signs saying, "Children deserve mercy." Police kept them separated. The tension was palpable. This wasn't just a sentencing. It had become a referendum on how society treats its youngest offenders when they commit its oldest crimes. Inside, the courtroom filled to capacity within minutes. Every seat taken, people standing along the back wall. The bailiff had to turn away dozens who couldn't fit. The judge's chambers had received hundreds of letters, some begging for leniency, others demanding the maximum sentence. Death threats had come too, from both sides. Extra security had been assigned. This case had touched something raw in the national consciousness. The family sat in the same seats they'd occupied during the victim impact hearing. Sarah's sister wore black. Michael's brother sat with his jaw clenched. The grandmother who'd left the photograph was there too, rosary beads wrapped around her fingers. They looked exhausted, hollowed out by grief that had nowhere to go except into this room, hoping for something that felt like justice, even though no sentence could bring back what they'd lost. Across the aisle, the defense table sat empty. Marcus Hale arrived at 8:30, carrying a briefcase that looked heavier than usual. He'd filed a last-minute motion requesting the judge reconsider certification, arguing one final time that adult sentencing for a 13-year-old violated the spirit of juvenile law. He knew it would be denied, but he had to try, had to give his client every possible chance. The defendant was brought in at 8:45. She looked different, thinner. Her cardigan hung loose on her frame. Her hair needed washing. The weeks in custody had stripped away the last vestiges of the confidence she'd worn like armor. Her eyes had dark circles underneath. She moved slowly, as if every step required effort. When she sat down, she kept her head lowered, didn't scan the gallery, didn't look for her aunt, just stared at the table in front of her. The photo the grandmother had left was gone, removed by court staff, but you could almost see its ghost there. The space where it had been seemed to pull at her attention. Marcus leaned over and whispered something. She nodded, without really listening. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. At 9 exactly, the bailiff called for everyone to rise. The judge entered. He looked tired too. This decision had weighed on him. You could see it in the set of his shoulders, the lines around his eyes. He carried a leather folder, thick with papers. He sat, arranged everything in front of him with deliberate care. The room settled into absolute silence. He looked up, scanned the courtroom. His gaze rested briefly on the family, then on the defendant. Then he began to speak. His voice was measured, each word chosen with precision. He said that in 30 years on the bench, he'd never faced a decision this difficult, that every factor pulled in opposite directions: age versus premeditation, potential for growth versus demonstrated danger, the purpose of juvenile law versus the reality of the harm caused. He acknowledged the defense's arguments about brain development, said he'd read every study Marcus had submitted, understood that adolescent minds were still forming, that impulse control and long-term thinking matured over time, that the entire foundation of juvenile justice rested on the belief that young people could change. He said he believed in that principle, had built his career on it, had seen countless juveniles turn their lives around with proper intervention. He paused, let that sink in. Then his tone shifted. But, he said, this case challenged that principle in ways he couldn't ignore. He referenced the evidence, the 3 weeks of planning, the research into hitmen and sentencing laws, the manipulation of an adult into committing violence, the complete lack of remorse before, during, and after, the psychological evaluations that showed someone operating with cognitive capacity beyond her years. He said the question before him wasn't whether she was a child. She was. The question was whether being a child excused, premeditated, calculated actions that resulted in 2 deaths. Whether age alone could shield someone from accountability when they demonstrated full understanding of what they were doing. He looked directly at her, said that every expert who'd evaluated her agreed on one thing. She'd understood the permanence of death, had known her parents would be gone forever, had proceeded anyway. That wasn't impulse, that wasn't immature judgment, that was choice. And choices, he said, carried consequences, even for children, especially when those choices destroyed lives. The courtroom held its collective breath. You could feel the tension mounting, every person waiting for the words that would determine not just her fate, but set precedent for cases to come. The judge flipped a page, continued. He said he'd also considered the victim impact statements, had listened to family members describe who Sarah and Michael had been, what their absence meant, the grandmother who'd lost her daughter, the brother who'd lost his best friend, the co-workers and neighbors who'd lost people they cared about. He said their pain was real and ongoing, that they would carry this loss for the rest of their lives, that justice required acknowledging that harm, requiring accountability for it. He said the purpose of sentencing wasn't revenge, but it also wasn't just rehabilitation. It was protection. It was deterrence. It was a statement about what society would and wouldn't tolerate. And in this case, he said, the harm was too severe and the danger too real to treat this as a typical juvenile matter. Then he announced his decision. The words fell like stones into still water, rippling outward through the room. He was imposing what he called a blended sentence. The defendant would be sentenced under adult guidelines, but would serve the initial portion in a juvenile facility. She would remain in juvenile custody until her 18th birthday. At that point, she would be transferred to adult prison to serve the remainder of her sentence. The total sentence, 40 years, with the possibility of parole after 25. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts. Someone screamed. The gavel came down hard. Once, twice, 3 times. Order. The judge's voice rose above the chaos. He wasn't finished. People needed to hear the rest. The noise subsided to shocked murmurs. The defendant sat frozen. Her face had gone completely white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The judge continued, explained his reasoning, said that keeping her in juvenile custody until 18 gave her the therapeutic intervention and education she needed. Programs designed for young people, mental health treatment, schooling, the chance to develop in an environment built for rehabilitation. But the transfer to adult prison at 18 acknowledged the severity of what she'd done, protected the community, ensured that the sentence matched the crime, regardless of her age when she committed it. He said this blended approach balanced the competing interests, recognized her youth while holding her accountable. It was unprecedented in their jurisdiction, would likely be appealed, but he believed it was just, believed it served both rehabilitation and protection, believed it sent the right message about accountability without abandoning hope for eventual redemption. He addressed her directly, told her she would have 5 years in juvenile custody to prove she could change, to engage with therapy, to show remorse, to develop the empathy that psychological evaluations said she lacked. He said those 5 years would determine what kind of adult she became, whether she used the time to grow or wasted it in denial. He said the system was giving her a chance, but it was up to her to take it. After 18, he said, she'd enter adult prison, would serve at least 7 more years before parole eligibility. And even then, parole would only be granted if she demonstrated genuine rehabilitation, understanding of her actions, capacity for empathy, commitment to never harming another person. It wasn't a guarantee. It was a possibility, one she'd have to earn through years of hard work and genuine change. Marcus immediately stood, said he'd be filing an appeal, that this sentence was excessive, that it effectively gave up on a child's capacity for rehabilitation. The judge acknowledged his right to appeal, said he expected nothing less. But the sentence stood. Diana Reeves stood next, said the prosecution respected the court's decision, believed it balanced justice with mercy, thanked the judge for his thoughtfulness. The family members had mixed reactions. Some nodded, satisfied. Others looked disappointed, perhaps wanting more. The grandmother just closed her eyes and moved her lips in silent prayer. And the defendant. She'd finally reacted. Her hands had gone to her face. Her shoulders shook. For the first time since her arrest, she was crying, not loud sobs, quiet, almost silent tears that streaked down her face and dripped onto the table. The judge wasn't done. He had more to say about the case itself, about what it meant. He said this wasn't about vengeance against a child. It was about recognizing that some actions crossed lines that age couldn't erase. That premeditated murder wasn't a youthful mistake, wasn't experimentation or rebellion. It was the deliberate ending of human lives. And when a 13-year-old could plan that with calculation and carry it out with help, the system had to respond in a way that protected everyone. He said he hoped this case would never need to serve as precedent, hoped no other judge would face this situation. But if they did, he wanted the reasoning documented, wanted the legal framework established. He'd written a 40-page opinion explaining every factor, every consideration, every legal principle that guided his decision. It would be published, studied, debated for years. He looked at the defendant one last time. His voice softened slightly, told her that 40 years seemed like forever when you were 13. But it wasn't a life sentence. She would be 53 when it ended, would have decades ahead of her still, decades to be someone different, to contribute something positive, to find redemption if she chose to seek it. He said the door wasn't completely closed, but she had to walk through it herself, had to do the work, make the changes, become the person her parents had hoped she'd be. His final words were simple. I hope you use this time wisely. I hope you learn what you should have known from the beginning, that every life has value, that actions have consequences, and that the people who loved you deserved better than what you gave them. The gavel came down. Final, absolute. Court was adjourned. The bailiff moved to take her into custody. She stood on shaking legs, turned toward the gallery one last time. Her aunt was there, standing, tears streaming down her face. The defendant looked at her, really looked. And for the first time, something broke in her expression. The wall she'd built crumbled. She mouthed something. It looked like, I'm sorry. Whether she meant it or was just finally scared enough to perform remorse, no one could say. The aunt nodded, touched her hand to her heart. The defendant was led away, through the side door, into a hallway that led to a van that would take her to a juvenile facility 2 hours north, where she'd spend the next 5 years learning what empathy meant, or at least learning to pretend. The courtroom cleared slowly. Journalists rushed out to file stories. The headlines were already being written. Judge makes history with blended sentence. 13-year-old gets 40 years in parents' murder. The legal community would debate this for decades. Some would call it groundbreaking. Others would call it cruel. But in that moment, in that courtroom, it felt like the only possible answer to an impossible question. How do you punish a child for an adult crime? How do you balance hope with accountability? The judge had tried, had threaded a needle so fine that neither side would be fully satisfied. But maybe that was justice. Not perfect, not clean, just the best attempt at fairness in a situation where fairness seemed impossible. Sarah's mother was the last to leave. She sat in her seat long after everyone else had gone, staring at the empty defense table, at the judge's bench, at the space where her great-granddaughter had heard the word 40 and finally understood that her life had changed forever. The old woman stood eventually, used her cane to steady herself, and as she walked toward the exit, she paused, looked back one more time at the courtroom where her daughter's memory had been honored, where justice had been sought, and, in some imperfect way, achieved. Then she walked out into the sunlight, into a world where Sarah and Michael were still gone, where no sentence could bring them back, but where at least someone had been held accountable, had been told that what she did mattered, that it wasn't okay, that it would never be okay. That was something. Not enough, never enough, but something. And sometimes, in the aftermath of unthinkable loss, something was all you could hope for. The appeals began within 30 days. Marcus Hale filed a motion arguing that the blended sentence violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment, that a 13-year-old couldn't constitutionally receive what amounted to a de facto life sentence, that the judge had overstepped his authority by creating a sentencing framework that didn't exist in statute. The brief was thorough, cited dozens of cases, referenced Supreme Court rulings about juvenile sentencing, Miller v. Alabama, Graham v. Florida, every precedent that established juveniles as fundamentally different from adults. The appellate court took 6 months to issue a ruling. During that time, she remained in the juvenile facility, waiting. Marcus visited monthly, told her to be patient, that the law was on their side. She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because the alternative was too heavy to carry. The appellate decision came down on a Tuesday morning. Affirmed. The three-judge panel had reviewed the case in its entirety, read the trial transcripts, examined the evidence, considered the constitutional arguments, and they agreed with the trial judge. The opinion, written by Judge Patricia Morrison, acknowledged that the sentence was severe, but severity alone didn't make it unconstitutional. The panel found that the blended approach actually demonstrated the trial judge's careful consideration of the defendant's age, that he'd balanced rehabilitation with accountability in a way that respected both her youth and the gravity of her crimes. The opinion noted that she would receive treatment in juvenile custody, would have access to education and therapy, would be given every opportunity to demonstrate growth before transfer to adult prison, and crucially, she had the possibility of parole. It wasn't a life sentence without hope. It was accountability with a path forward. The appeals were denied. Marcus filed with the state Supreme Court. Same arguments, different jurisdiction. The Supreme Court declined to hear the case, said the appellate ruling was sound. That established precedent. Then he filed a federal habeas petition, argued that her constitutional rights had been violated. That took another year to wind through the system, another year of waiting, another year of hope, slowly deflating. The federal court denied the petition, said state courts had adequately addressed all constitutional issues. There were no more appeals, no more legal maneuvers. The sentence was final. She was 16 when the last denial came through, had already served 3 years in juvenile custody, had 2 years left before transfer. The finality of it settled over her like a weight she'd never fully shake. This was real. This was permanent. This was the rest of her life. The case, meanwhile, had taken on a life beyond her. Law schools taught it in criminal justice courses, used it as an example of the tensions between juvenile rehabilitation and public safety. Defense attorneys studied it to understand the limits of age-based arguments. Prosecutors studied it to see how premeditation could overcome youth-based protections. Academic papers were written analyzing the blended sentencing approach. Some argued it was the future of juvenile justice, a way to handle the rare cases where young offenders committed adult crimes. Others argued it undermined the entire juvenile system, created a slippery slope where more and more children could be sentenced as adults. The debate raged in legal journals and policy conferences while she sat in a facility 2 hours from where her parents had lived and died. Inside the juvenile detention center, she was no longer special, no longer the girl who'd made national headlines, just another resident in a system full of troubled kids. She had a room, 8 by 10 feet, a bed, a desk, a small window that overlooked the courtyard. She attended classes with other juveniles, math, English, science, sat in the back row and did the work because there was nothing else to do. The teachers knew who she was, everyone did, but they treated her like any other student. No special attention, no extra scrutiny, just another kid serving time. She made acquaintances, but not friends, kept to herself mostly. Learned early that sharing her story made people uncomfortable, made them look at her differently, so she stopped sharing, became quiet, withdrawn, the opposite of the girl who'd walked into court with a smirk. Therapy was mandatory 3 times a week. Individual sessions with a counselor named Dr. Ellen Krause, who specialized in juvenile offenders. Dr. Krause had been doing this for 20 years, had worked with kids who'd committed terrible acts, kids who'd hurt people, killed people. She approached each session with the same question, can this person change? With most kids, she found the answer was yes. They'd acted impulsively, out of trauma, out of circumstances they couldn't control. Given time and intervention, they developed empathy, understanding, remorse. With her, progress was slower. She attended every session, answered questions, completed assignments. But Dr. Krause couldn't shake the feeling that she was performing, going through the motions, saying what she thought people wanted to hear. When asked how she felt about her parents, she said sad. When asked if she understood the harm she'd caused, she said yes, but the words felt hollow, rehearsed, like reading lines from a script. 2 years into her custody, something shifted. She was 15, had been watching younger kids come through the facility, 12, 13, 14-year-olds who cried themselves to sleep, who talked about missing their families, who showed genuine remorse for what they'd done. She saw herself in them, or rather, saw what she hadn't been, the grief, the regret, the humanity. One night, she asked her roommate why she cried so much. The girl, in for assault, looked at her like the question was absurd. "Because I hurt someone," she said. because I can't take it back." The simplicity of that answer haunted her. She'd never cried about hurting someone, only about getting caught, about facing consequences. The realization cracked something inside her, not wide open, but enough to let a sliver of truth through. She started engaging differently in therapy, asked Dr. Krause why she didn't feel things the way other people did, why remorse felt like a concept she understood intellectually but couldn't access emotionally. Dr. Krause explained personality development, talked about empathy as a skill that could be learned even if it didn't come naturally, said that understanding her deficits was the first step toward growth. They worked on perspective-taking exercises. She'd read scenarios and have to identify what each person in the scenario might be feeling. At first, she got them all wrong, couldn't distinguish between anger and hurt, between fear and sadness. But slowly, over months, she improved, started recognizing patterns, started understanding that what people said and what they felt weren't always the same. It wasn't empathy yet, not real, felt empathy, but it was progress, a foundation, something to build on. Outside the facility, the world moved on. Willow Lane recovered from the tragedy that had marked it. The house at number 42 sat empty for 2 years. No one wanted to buy it. The stigma was too heavy. Eventually, Sarah's sister hired a company to clean it out, donated the furniture, boxed up photo albums and personal items, put them in storage because she couldn't look at them but couldn't throw them away either. The house was sold at a loss to a developer who gutted the interior, changed everything, new walls, new floors, new paint, erased every trace of the family who'd lived there. A young couple bought it. Didn't know the history until after they'd moved in. A neighbor told them. They were horrified at first, considered selling, but they needed the space, had a baby on the way. Eventually decided that what had happened there didn't define what the house could become. They planted flowers in the yard, painted the shutters, made it theirs. The neighbors remembered, though. Mrs. Chen still thought about it every time she walked past, remembered the police tape, the news vans, the morning she'd heard unusual sounds and done nothing. Mr. Mareki Patel sometimes stopped on his evening walks, looked at the house, wondered if he should have paid more attention, should have noticed something was wrong. The guilt faded over time but never disappeared completely. They'd known Michael and Sarah, had waved to them, borrowed tools, complained about weather, and then one day they were gone, erased from the neighborhood like they'd never existed. Eventually, new families moved in. Kids who didn't know the history played in yards where journalists had once stood. Life continued, but the older residents remembered, would always remember. Back at the juvenile facility, her 18th birthday approached. The transfer loomed like a storm on the horizon. Dr. Krause prepared her as best she could, explained that adult prison would be different, harder, more dangerous, that the therapy and education available in juvenile custody wouldn't exist in the same way on the other side, that she needed to use the remaining months to solidify the progress she'd made, to develop coping strategies, to prepare mentally for what was coming. She listened, nodded, asked practical questions about what to expect. Dr. Krause wrote a final evaluation, noted that the defendant had made progress, had developed some capacity for perspective-taking, showed less narcissistic behavior than at intake, but cautioned that true empathy remained elusive, that she'd learned to perform remorse more convincingly, but whether she genuinely felt it was unclear. The evaluation was honest, neither damning nor praising, just truthful. 3 weeks before her 18th birthday, Marcus came to visit, told her he'd done everything he could, that the appeals were exhausted, that transfer was inevitable. She thanked him for trying, meant it. He'd fought for her when no one else would, had believed in the possibility that she could change even when the evidence suggested otherwise. He asked what she planned to do, how she'd handle the next 7 years until parole eligibility. She said she'd survive, would keep working on herself, would try to become someone worthy of eventual release. He believed her, or wanted to, told her to write if she needed anything, left knowing he'd probably never see her again. His job was done. Her future was up to her now. The day before her 18th birthday, Dr. Krause had a final session with her, asked if she had any last questions. She was quiet for a long time, then asked the question she'd never voiced before. "Do you think I can ever be normal? Feel things the way other people do?" Dr. Krause considered carefully before answering, said that normal was subjective, that she might never feel empathy the way some people did. But that didn't mean she couldn't make good choices, couldn't live a productive life, couldn't avoid hurting others. That understanding harm intellectually could be enough if she committed to it. That growth wasn't always about feeling. Sometimes it was about choosing, about deciding who you wanted to be and working toward it every day. The girl nodded, said she'd try. Dr. Krauss said that was all anyone could ask. On her 18th birthday, she packed her few belongings, said goodbye to no one because she'd made no real friends, was processed out of juvenile custody, and directly into the adult system. The transfer van drove her 3 hours to a women's prison in the northern part of the state. She watched the landscape change through reinforced windows, watched the last traces of her childhood disappear behind her. She'd served 5 years in juvenile custody, had 20 more ahead before parole consideration. The math was crushing. She'd be 38, middle-aged, half her life spent behind bars, but she'd known this was coming, had had 5 years to prepare. As the prison gates opened and the van pulled through, she made herself a promise. She'd use the time, would keep learning, keep growing, would become someone her parents might have been proud of if they'd lived long enough to see it. It was too late to change what she'd done, but maybe not too late to change who she was. The gates closed behind her with a sound of finality that echoed in her chest. This was her life now. This was justice. Heavy, permanent, inescapable. And somewhere on a street called Willow Lane, an empty driveway where her parents had once parked sat quiet in the afternoon sun. A space that would never be filled. A loss that would never be recovered. A reminder that some things, once broken, stayed broken forever. 7 years passed. 7 years of concrete walls and metal doors, of routine so rigid it became invisible. Wake at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work assignment at 7, lunch at noon, recreation at 2, dinner at 5, lights out at 10. Every day the same. Every day a small mark on a calendar that stretched impossibly far into the future. She was 25 now, no longer the girl who'd smirked in a courtroom, no longer the teenager who'd thought her age made her untouchable. Time had worn those edges smooth, replaced arrogance with something quieter, something harder to name. She worked in the prison library, shelving books, helping other inmates find materials for their appeals or their education. It was quiet work, solitary, suited her, gave her time to think, and she'd done a lot of thinking in 7 years. The adult prison had been exactly what Dr. Krauss warned it would be: harder, more dangerous. The first year was the worst. She was young, vulnerable, had to learn fast how to navigate hierarchies and unwritten rules, had to learn when to speak and when to stay silent, when to stand her ground and when to walk away. She'd been tested, challenged. There were women inside who saw her age and her crime and wanted to prove something, wanted to show that being young didn't make you special. She'd had to fight twice in the first 6 months, not because she wanted to, because refusing would have marked her as weak. She'd lost both fights, but earned a grudging respect for not backing down. After that, people mostly left her alone. She wasn't part of any group, didn't align with any faction, just existed in the margins, quiet, careful, invisible. Education became her focus because there was nothing else. She finished her high school equivalency in the first year, started taking college courses through a prison program, studied psychology, found herself drawn to understanding the thing she'd always lacked: empathy, emotional connection, the ability to care about others beyond what they could do for you. She read textbooks about attachment theory and moral development, learned that the traits she demonstrated as a child had names: callous, unemotional traits, conduct disorder, early markers of what would become antisocial personality disorder in adulthood. Reading about herself in clinical terms was strange, like looking at an X-ray and seeing the fractures you'd never known were there. It didn't excuse what she'd done, nothing could, but it helped her understand how she'd become someone capable of it. Therapy in adult prison was different than it had been in juvenile custody. No more 3 sessions a week with someone dedicated to her rehabilitation. Just monthly group sessions focused on anger management and impulse control. She attended because it was required, sat in circles with women who'd killed in moments of rage or fear or desperation, listened to their stories, heard them talk about the moment they snapped, the second everything changed. She never shared her own story. When it was her turn, she talked in generalities, boundaries, about learning to manage emotions, about making better choices. The therapist running the group knew who she was, what she'd done, but didn't push, just let her participate at her own pace. After 2 years, the therapist pulled her aside, said she'd noticed the girl was different from the others, that her crime hadn't been about losing control, had been about having too much of it, asked if she understood the difference. She said yes, said that was the problem, that she'd controlled everything except the part of herself that should have stopped her. The letters started in her 3rd year of adult custody, from her aunt, the only family member who'd maintained contact. Short letters at first, updates about the weather, about small things happening in her life, never mentioning the trial, never mentioning Sarah and Michael, just creating a thread of connection to the outside world. She didn't respond at first, didn't know what to say. What did you write to someone whose sister you'd orchestrated the elimination of? But the letters kept coming, once a month, consistent, until finally she wrote back, kept it brief, said thank you for not forgetting about her, said she was trying to be better. The aunt wrote back immediately, said she knew, said she was praying for her, said that forgiveness was possible if she truly changed. Not forgiveness from the family, that might never come, but forgiveness from God, from herself. The letters continued, became a lifeline neither of them had expected. In her 4th year, something happened that changed her perspective. A new inmate arrived, young, 19, convicted of vehicular manslaughter, had been drunk driving and killed a mother and her child. The girl was destroyed by guilt, cried constantly, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Other inmates grew annoyed with her, told her to toughen up, but she couldn't. The weight of what she'd done was crushing her. One night, she found the defendant in the library, asked how she lived with it, how she got through each day knowing what she'd done. The defendant looked at her for a long moment, then said something true, said it never gets easier. You just get used to carrying it. That guilt was supposed to be heavy. It meant you understood what you'd taken. The girl asked if she felt guilty. The defendant paused, then said honestly, I'm learning to. It was the most truthful thing she'd said in years. That conversation stayed with her, made her realize how far she'd come and how far she still had to go. She felt something when she looked at that 19-year-old drowning in remorse. Not quite empathy, but recognition, understanding. She saw the difference between them. The girl had killed accidentally, felt immediate, crushing guilt, would carry that weight forever, but might eventually learn to live alongside it. She had killed deliberately, had felt nothing for years, was only now, slowly, beginning to understand the enormity of what she'd done. The timelines were different, the journeys were different, but maybe the destination could be the same. Maybe she could get to a place where the weight felt real, where it meant something, where it changed her. By year 5, she'd completed an associate's degree in psychology, started working as a peer counselor in the prison, helping other inmates navigate their sentences, process their crimes, plan for eventual release. It was strange being on the other side of therapy, listening instead of being listened to. She wasn't licensed, wasn't qualified in any official sense, but she understood something the traditional therapists didn't. She understood what it felt like to be fundamentally disconnected from your own emotions, to know intellectually that you should feel something, but to experience only emptiness. Some of the women she worked with had that same disconnect, had done terrible things without the expected emotional response. She could talk to them in ways the therapists couldn't, could say, I know you don't feel what you're supposed to feel, but you can still choose not to hurt anyone again. Some of them listened, some didn't, but the work gave her purpose, made the days mean something beyond just survival. The parole hearing approached in her 7th year, 25 years old, eligible for parole after serving a total of 12 years between juvenile and adult custody. She knew the odds, knew that most people convicted of murder served far longer before their first parole, knew that her age at the time of the crime made her case unusual, made parole boards nervous. What if they released her and she hurt someone else? What if the change wasn't real? What if she'd just learned to perform remorse better? Marcus, who'd stayed in occasional contact, helped her prepare, explained what the board would ask, what they'd want to hear. But he cautioned her against performing, said they'd seen thousands of inmates try to game the system. The only thing that might work was honesty, brutal, uncomfortable honesty about who she'd been and who she was trying to become. The parole hearing took place in a small room inside the prison. 5 board members sat behind a table. Her aunt was there, the only person who'd agreed to speak on her behalf. Representatives from the victim's family were there too. Sarah's sister, Michael's brother. They had the right to speak against her release, to remind the board what she'd taken from them. She entered in prison clothes, sat at a small table facing the board. Her hands were shaking, not from fear of denial, from the weight of finally having to account for everything, to say aloud what she'd been thinking for 7 years. The chairwoman of the board, a stern woman in her 60s, opened a file, read the crime aloud, the planning, the execution, the complete lack of remorse at trial. Then asked the first question, "Do you believe you deserve parole?" She took a breath, answered carefully, "No, I don't think I deserve it. I don't think anything I do will ever make me deserve it. I took 2 people who loved me and erased them from the world because I didn't want to follow their rules. There's no deserving parole after that. But I'm asking for it anyway, not because I've earned it, but because I'm not the same person who did that, and I think I can contribute something if given the chance." The board members watched her closely, looking for signs of manipulation, of rehearsed answers. She continued, "I know what you're thinking, that I'm just saying what you want to hear, that psychopaths learn to mimic emotions, that someone with my history can't change. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am just better at pretending now, but I've spent 7 years trying to understand what I did, not justifying it, understanding it. And I know now that I was missing something fundamental. I didn't value human life, didn't see people as real, just as obstacles or tools. I'm still missing parts of that. I probably always will be, but I understand it now, and I choose not to hurt anyone. That has to count for something." The board asked about her therapy, her education, her work as a peer counselor. She answered each question directly, didn't embellish, didn't try to make herself sound better than she was. When asked if she felt remorse, she paused, said, "I feel something. I don't know if it's what other people mean by remorse, but when I think about my parents now, I feel heavy, like I'm carrying something I can't put down. I think about the grandmother who came to court, who left that photo. I think about my aunt who keeps writing even though I destroyed her sister. I think about the life I could have had if I'd just been different, and it hurts. Not the way guilt is supposed to hurt maybe, but it hurts, and I don't want to cause that hurt to anyone else, ever." Then came the victim statements. Sarah's sister stood. Her hair had gone gray in the 12 years since the trial. She looked older, worn down by grief that time had softened, but never erased. She spoke directly to the board, said she didn't believe the defendant had changed, that psychopaths learned to say the right things but couldn't change what they were, that releasing her would dishonor Sarah and Michael's memory, would send a message that planning your parents' murder at 13 could be forgiven with a little therapy and some college courses. She said 12 years wasn't enough, would never be enough, that Sarah had been 42 when she died, had lived 42 years. The defendant had taken all the years Sarah would have had after that, all the birthdays, all the holidays, all the moments. How could 12 years in prison balance that? She sat down. Michael's brother spoke next, said similar things, that no amount of time could make this right, that she should serve every day of her 40-year sentence. Then the aunt stood. The board looked surprised. She was technically a victim's family member. They'd expected her to speak against parole too, but she didn't. She talked about watching her niece grow up, about the sweet child she'd been before something went wrong, about visiting her every few months for the past 12 years, watching her change, watching the arrogance fade, the defenses crumble. She said she wasn't sure if it was real change or learned behavior, but she believed people could grow, believed that keeping someone in prison purely for punishment when they might be able to contribute something positive to the world was wasteful. She said her sister would have wanted her daughter to have a chance, would have believed in redemption. She couldn't speak for Sarah. No one could. But she thought Sarah would have wanted to see her daughter become someone better. The aunt's voice broke. "I lost my sister. I'll never get her back, but maybe we don't have to lose her daughter too." The board deliberated for an hour. She waited in a holding cell, couldn't eat the sandwich they brought her, couldn't think about anything except the possibility that she might walk out of this building someday, might breathe air that didn't taste like prison, might have a chance to be something other than inmate number 47239. When they called her back in, she knew from their faces, denied. The chairwoman explained that while they acknowledged her progress, 12 years wasn't sufficient for the severity of the crime. that the psychological evaluations, while showing improvement, still raised concerns about her capacity for genuine empathy. That public safety required caution. They would reconsider her case in 5 years. She was 25, would be 30 at her next hearing. She nodded, said she understood, was led back to her cell. That night, she didn't cry, just sat on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. 5 more years, then another hearing, maybe another denial. Maybe she'd spend the rest of her life inside these walls. The thought should have crushed her, but instead, she felt something unexpected. Acceptance. This was justice. This was what she'd earned. And maybe that understanding was growth in itself. The case continued to echo through the legal system. New judges read the opinion when facing similar situations. Defense attorneys cited it when arguing against adult certification. Prosecutors cited it when arguing for it. The blended sentencing approach had been adopted in 3 other states, modified, adapted to their own laws. But the core principle remained. That age didn't automatically shield someone from accountability when they demonstrated adult-level planning and understanding. The debate continued in academic circles. Was it fair? Was it effective? Did it serve justice or just satisfy public anger? There were no easy answers. Just the ongoing struggle to balance competing values. Rehabilitation versus protection. Youth versus culpability. Hope versus accountability. On Willow Lane, the house at number 42 had changed hands twice more. The current owners were a retired couple who'd moved from another state, knew nothing about its history, loved the quiet neighborhood, the friendly neighbors, the sense of community. They'd painted the exterior blue, installed solar panels, built a garden in the backyard. The house had become something new, something unconnected to its past. But the older residents remembered. Mrs. Chen had passed away 3 years ago. Mr. Patel still walked his dog every evening, sometimes paused in front of the house. Remembered that terrible morning, the police tape, the news vans, the loss of neighbors who'd been part of the fabric of the street. He'd think about the girl who'd caused it all, wonder where she was now, if she'd changed. If prison had taught her anything, then he'd continue his walk. Let the memory fade back into the past where it belonged. In the prison library, she shelved books and thought about her next parole hearing. 5 years away, she'd be 30, would have served 17 years total, more than half her life. She'd continue her education, work on her counseling skills, try to become someone the board might consider releasing. But she'd also accepted that release might never come, that she might die in prison, that this might be all there was. And strangely, that acceptance had brought a kind of peace. She wasn't fighting her sentence anymore, wasn't looking for loopholes or arguing the unfairness of it. She was just living it, day by day, trying to be better than she'd been, trying to help others avoid the mistakes she'd made. It wasn't redemption, not yet, maybe never, but it was something. It was growth. It was the opposite of the smirk she'd worn into court 12 years ago. Sometimes, late at night, she thought about her parents, not the way she used to, not as obstacles she'd removed, but as people. She'd look at the photo her aunt had given her, the one from the beach, her between them, all 3 smiling. She'd study their faces, try to remember things she'd blocked out. Her mother's laugh, her father's terrible jokes, the way they'd both shown up to her soccer games even though she'd been terrible at soccer, the small kindnesses she'd dismissed as control. She'd think about the life they'd wanted for her, the person they'd hoped she'd become, and she'd feel that heaviness again, that weight in her chest that might be grief, might be guilt, might be the beginning of understanding what she'd destroyed. She couldn't bring them back, couldn't undo what she'd done, but she could carry them with her, could try to honor their memory by becoming someone they might have been proud of. It was a small thing, insignificant in the face of what she'd taken, but it was all she had. The judge who'd sentenced her had retired 5 years ago, spent his days gardening and volunteering at a legal aid clinic, but he still thought about the case sometimes, about the 13-year-old who'd smirked in his courtroom, about the impossible decision he'd had to make. He'd followed her progress through the system, knew about the parole denial, wasn't surprised. He believed he'd made the right call with the blended sentence, had given her a chance at eventual freedom while protecting the community. Whether she took that chance was up to her. He hoped she would, hoped the girl who'd been so broken at 13 had found some way to heal. But he knew that healing wasn't guaranteed, that some people never found it, that justice could create the conditions for change, but couldn't force it to happen. All he'd been able to do was make a decision based on the evidence and the law and his best judgment about what was right. The rest was beyond his control. In the courtroom where it had all happened, new cases cycled through, new defendants, new victims, new families torn apart by crime and violence. The building didn't remember, didn't carry the weight of everything that had been decided within its walls. But the people did. The bailiff who'd escorted her to custody had retired. The court reporter who'd transcribed every word had moved to another jurisdiction. But they remembered the girl who'd smiled when murder charges were read, who'd doodled during testimony, who'd finally cried when she heard the word 40. They wondered about her sometimes, if she'd changed, if she'd become someone different, if the system had saved her or just warehoused her. There were no answers, just questions that lingered in the spaces between cases. The legacy of the case was complicated. Some saw it as justice served, a child held accountable for adult crimes, a system that didn't bow to age alone but considered the totality of actions. Others saw it as failure, a child abandoned by a system meant to rehabilitate, a sentence that prioritized punishment over hope. Both perspectives had truth in them. Both missed parts of the whole picture because the reality was messy. Was a 13-year-old who'd planned murder with chilling calculation? Was a system trying to respond to something it wasn't designed for? Was a judge making an impossible choice with imperfect information? Was a girl who'd lost everything because she'd destroyed everything? Was a family still grieving 12 years later? Was all of it at once? Complex, contradictory, painfully human. She thought about the judge's final words sometimes, about how he'd told her that 53 wasn't the end, that she'd still have decades ahead if she served the full sentence, that redemption was possible if she chose to seek it. At 25, 53 seemed impossibly far away, but also closer than it had been at 18. Time moved differently in prison, slowly and quickly at once. Days crawled, years flew. She'd be 30 before she knew it. 35, 40. The years would pass whether she used them or wasted them. She decided to use them, to keep learning, keep growing, keep trying to become someone worthy of the freedom she might someday earn, not because she deserved it, but because the alternative was giving up, becoming exactly what everyone said she was, unfixable, irredeemable, lost. The echo of the gavel still resonated 12 years later. In legal textbooks, in policy debates, in the minds of everyone who'd been in that courtroom the day she was sentenced, the sound of authority meeting arrogance, of accountability catching up to someone who'd thought herself untouchable. She'd been wrong about so many things, about her age protecting her, about the system bending to accommodate her youth, about consequences being negotiable. The gavel had proved otherwise, had declared that some actions transcended age, that planning and premeditation mattered, that the lives she'd taken had value that her age couldn't diminish. It had been a hard lesson, one that had cost her everything. But maybe that was the point. Maybe some lessons had to be hard to mean anything. In the end, the story didn't have a neat conclusion. No redemption arc that tied everything together. No moment where she became fully healed or the family fully recovered. Just ongoing struggle, ongoing growth, ongoing grief. She was still in prison, still trying to become better. The family was still mourning, still living with the absence of Sarah and Michael. The legal system was still debating how to handle cases like hers. Life continued, messy, imperfect, unresolved. But maybe that was okay. Maybe justice wasn't about perfect endings. Maybe it was about holding people accountable while leaving the door open for change. Maybe it was about balancing the harm done with the possibility of growth. Maybe it was about acknowledging that 13-year-olds can make monstrous choices while still being children who might become something different. She thought she was untouchable. The gavel proved otherwise. That was the truth at the heart of everything. The simple, brutal truth that actions had consequences regardless of age, that arrogance couldn't protect you from accountability, that the law would bend to acknowledge youth but wouldn't break to excuse evil. She'd learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, had lost her freedom, her family, her future, and somewhere in the loss, in the endless days and years of carrying the weight of what she'd done, she'd begun to understand, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to know that she'd been wrong. that her parents had deserved better, that their lives had mattered more than her freedom. That understanding had come too late to save anyone, but maybe not too late to mean something, maybe not too late to change who she'd become. And on Willow Lane, where it had all begun, life went on. Children played, families gathered, the seasons changed. Spring brought flowers, summer brought heat, fall brought colored leaves, winter brought snow. The cycle continued, indifferent to the tragedy that had once shattered the peace. The house at number 42 stood quiet among the others. Just a house now, not a crime scene, not a memorial, just a building where people lived and made new memories. But in the collective memory of the neighborhood, in the stories the older residents told, Sarah and Michael remained. A reminder that evil could bloom anywhere. That even in quiet neighborhoods with trimmed lawns and friendly waves, darkness could take root. That safety was an illusion we maintained because the alternative was too frightening, that the person who hurt you might be the one you loved most. The story ended there, not with resolution, not with redemption, just with time passing and people trying to move forward. The defendant in prison, working toward a parole she might never receive. The family in their separate lives, carrying grief that had become part of who they were. The legal system still wrestling with how to handle the next case like this one. The neighborhood still remembering, even as new families replaced old ones. And somewhere, in all of it, the faint echo of a gavel, a sound that represented authority speaking louder than arrogance. Justice, imperfect but present. Accountability, delayed but delivered. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending. And sometimes, in the aftermath of unspeakable tragedy, that was all anyone could hope for. If you believe justice was served, remember this story. Share it with others who need to understand that age explains behavior, but doesn't erase harm. That the system, when it works, balances mercy with accountability. That some smirks fade when confronted with the weight of real consequences. And that the gavel, when it falls, speaks for those who can no longer speak for themselves.